There is a skeleton near Good Springs. It is sitting against a rock, facing the water. Whatever killed it did not leave a mark. No bullet holes, no blast damage, no signs of a struggle. It simply sat down, facing the desert, and stopped. The ground around it is stained dark in a perfect circle. The water it was sitting beside still moves. Something still drinks from that water. You can hear it, sometimes, before dawn. A soft sound, patient, like something that has all the time in the world. Welcome to Fallout's most disturbing creatures, to fall asleep to. Tonight, we are not talking about bosses. We are not counting damage numbers or ranking difficulty levels. We are walking through the places these creatures actually live. The dry roads, the broken towns, the basements, the dark. And we are asking a simple question. What did the bombs actually leave behind? If this is your first time here, consider subscribing. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Now, let us begin. The rad scorpion that lives near Good Springs water source is not the largest version of its kind. That is the first thing worth understanding. When Fallout 3 introduced these creatures to players exploring the eastern ruins, they were enormous. Heavy-shelled, slow, deliberate. They moved like armored vehicles through the grey landscape. Each one was a wall of chitin and aggression. Getting near one felt like standing too close to a machine that had not yet decided whether to notice you. The Mojave version is different. Smaller in size, but the comparison ends there. 200 years of open desert-shaped something that traded bulk for speed. Its legs are longer relative to its body. It moves in short bursts, stopping to read the ground with its sensors before closing the gap. What it lost in mass, it gained in something harder to outrun, a venom that does not announce itself. A sting from the eastern version knocked targets back, dealt immediate damage, left bruises that were visible and dramatic. A sting from the desert version enters the bloodstream quietly. The effects begin slowly, a slight heaviness in the limbs, a drop in coordination. Then, minutes later, the real damage begins. By the time the prey understands what has happened, the rad scorpion is already somewhere nearby, waiting, still, patient as the sand. The desert did not make its creatures bigger. It made them smarter about time. The bloatfly does not look dangerous. That is the first lie the open desert tells. Along the stretch of broken highway south of Boulder City, these creatures drift in loose formations, drifting rather than flying, because their wings seem almost incidental to their movement, as though the air itself is carrying them somewhere it has already decided. They are bloated, soft-bodied, and slow, compared to almost everything else alive in the Mojave. A person with a stick could kill one. The problem is that there are rarely fewer than 4, and the problem after that is what they do before you reach them. Bloatflies fire larval spines. This is worth stopping to consider. An insect, roughly the size of a dinner plate, launches pieces of its own biological material at targets from a distance. When the development team at Obsidian Entertainment built the original design for this creature, it was meant to be a close-range pest. It would swarm and bite, the way flies and similar insects have always behaved. The ranged attack was added later in production, and the animation used to deliver it was borrowed from an unused attack file originally built for the Cazador. Because of this, the motion does not sit quite right on the bloatfly's body. The angle is slightly off. The spine launch happens from a position that does not match the creature's anatomy. Players noticed none of this. They saw a creature that fired pieces of itself and concluded this was exactly what the Wasteland had intended to build. The attack became part of the canon. A creature that projects its own larva as ammunition. An accident of development that is now an established biological fact. Something about the open highway made that accident feel inevitable. East of the desert, in the grey, heavy air of the Capital Wasteland, something very different moves near the edges of Evergreen Mills. The raider settlement at Evergreen Mills is loud, generators, shouting, the sounds of a population that has built something rough and permanent on the ruins of a mall. The noise fades about 200 meters from the outer boundary. In that quiet margin, where the settlement ends and the broken road begins, there are centaurs. Multiple bodies, fused together by a process called the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV. Arms from more than one source, mouths from more than one face. Movement that belongs to nothing, that has a single, recognizable origin. Their placement near Evergreen Mills was not written into any development document as intentional storytelling. The design team needed hostile creatures in the surrounding area, and centaurs were placed there, along with other threats, as environmental filler. But the accidental meaning of that placement has held for decades. Supermutants, themselves products of FEV, controlled territory near Evergreen Mills. Centaurs are what FEV produces when the process goes wrong, when multiple biological sources are exposed together without the structure that creates a supermutant. The natural conclusion, drawn from nothing more than where the creatures were placed on a map, is that supermutants were using the land outside the settlement as a site for failed experiments. Things that did not turn out correctly were left outside. They did not die. They simply became something else in the shadow of the place that made them. No document confirms this. The map did not need one. Older than the eastern ruins. Older than what the Capital Wasteland became. In the underground levels of the Mariposa military base in California, something the Unity called a floater was placed in the dark and left there. The floater is a bloated, tentacled organism produced by FEV exposure on material that was not fully controlled. In the first two Fallout games, they appear in military spaces, bases, corridors, the infrastructure of the old world's military machine. Cut dialogue recovered from Fallout 2 reveals that the Master, the entity responsible for the Unity's super mutant program, considered floaters a failed attempt at a biological weapon. The concept was not wrong, in his estimation. The execution was. The goal was a creature that could be directed, something that would follow instruction, that could be aimed like a living projectile. The mechanism that would have produced that obedience was never successfully developed. Floaters remained feral. They drifted. They attacked without direction. They were, in the language of military development, a prototype that never made it past testing. When the series moved east with Fallout 3, floaters were removed entirely. But they were not quietly removed. They were removed late. A texture file remains in the game's data, labeled simply Floater, Body, Veshies 2. A second version was being built for the Capital Wasteland. It was ready enough to have an asset. It was cut before it had a reason. Somewhere in the development of that eastern landscape, someone decided that what the Mojave's predecessor had left in its basements should stay buried there. What was buried does not always remain where it was placed. The Springvale School is quiet before you go in. The building sits on the edge of the ruined suburb, windows dark, interior sealed from the road. Nothing about its exterior suggests it contains anything worth investigating. It does not signal what is in its basement. Mole rats have been a part of the wasteland's surface ecology since the first Fallout game. They are burrowing rodents, expanded by radiation, into something roughly the size of a large dog, with a flattened snout and a low, wide body designed for underground movement. In terms of threat level, they sit at the lower end of what the open world produces. A prepared traveler rarely considers them a serious danger. What makes the version beneath Springvale School different is not what it looks like. It is what it sounds like. The sound team responsible for Fallout 3's audio design needed an idle sound for the mole rat, something biological, rhythmic, and subterranean. They found their answer in a recorded dolphin vocalization, pitched down significantly and layered with a low, continuous hum. The result is a sound that does not belong to anything familiar. It has the wet quality of something alive, the rhythm of something breathing, and a frequency low enough to feel physical in a closed space. Players who encountered mole rats in the Springvale basement, where the ceiling is low and the sound has nowhere to go, consistently reported that the noise reached them before the creatures did. The clicking arrived first, then the scuffling, then the movement at the edge of the flashlight's reach. The development team documented this as an accidental outcome. They were looking for something underground feeling. They found something that the dark made much worse. Beneath the suburb of Greyditch, A queen has not moved in 200 years. The fire ant infestation in this part of the Capital Wasteland begins at the surface. Singed ground, burnt furniture, a neighborhood that shows the evidence of something that used heat as a tool. The source is underground. In a tunnel system beneath the residential streets, a fire ant queen occupies a chamber and does not leave it. She was there before anyone came. She will be there after anyone leaves. Attacking her from a distance does not cause her to advance. She absorbs whatever is directed at her from exactly where she stands. This behavior is the result of a code flag, labeled Queen Stath, embedded in her AI data. The flag prevents movement regardless of external stimulus. What makes this particular detail interesting is that the same flag appears in the data of a robot that was planned for a downloadable content expansion that was later cancelled. One developer, working across two separate projects, wrote a behavioral rule for immobility and then applied it to both a mechanical construction and an insect monarch. The queen's stillness, which players interpreted as ceremonial, as the posture of something that has decided this specific chamber belongs to it, was a piece of repurposed code from a robot that was never released. The regality was borrowed from a machine that no one ever saw. Something about that stillness held meaning that the code did not intend to create. The last stop on this first stretch of road is a gas station. Rockbreaker's last gas sits on a long section of empty highway in the Capital Wasteland's outer territory. It is the kind of location that accumulates a particular silence, the silence of something that was once a point of passage, a place where people stopped, and has not been a place where people stop in a very long time. A yaoguai lives near it. The yaoguai is a ghoulified black bear, radiation damage having stripped some of the original animal's shape while keeping the essential mass. They are fast. They are aggressive. In almost every documented encounter, they charge from significant range. They detect prey at a distance, and they close that distance immediately. The one at Rockbreaker's last gas does not do this. It waits. It stays still until approached directly, until something enters the radius immediately around it. No developer commentary has ever addressed why this specific animal behaves differently from every other member of its species in the game. In Fallout 4, yaoguai were built faster and more reactive. In Fallout 76, a scorched version was added to the existing behavioral template. Neither game included a waiting variant. It exists once, at one gas station, in a region full of creatures that announce their aggression from a distance. One yaoguai at a broken fuel stop learned, or was left, to simply stay. What the bombs placed on the surface was not violence. It was patience, distributed across every species, in every form. The slow venom, the drifting flight, the fused mass at the camp's edge, the queen in the chamber, the bear at the pump. Patience, wearing different shapes, waiting at different distances. The surface is full of it. It has been full of it for 200 years. Tomorrow, the road moves underground. The creatures beneath the soil were not left there by the bombs. They were built there. That is a different kind of waiting entirely. The last entry in Vault-22's research log was never finished. A scientist sat down at a terminal on the lower levels, typed the date, and began a sentence. The sentence stops at the 7th word. No period, no correction, just 7 words and then nothing. A cursor that has been blinking in an abandoned facility for roughly 200 years, waiting for the rest of a thought that was never going to arrive. Whatever interrupted that sentence is still down there, still moving through those halls. It has the hands that typed those 7 words. It has the body of the person who sat down at that screen. What it no longer carries is any awareness that it was ever either of those things. The vaults were built to save human life. Several of them produced something else entirely. Vault 22 began as a reasonable idea. In the years after the bombs fell, food production was one of the most pressing problems any surviving group would face. Vault-Tec dedicated an entire sealed facility to post-war agriculture, a place where plant science could be studied under controlled conditions, eventually producing methods that might feed a recovering population. The people chosen to live inside were researchers. The lower levels were converted into growing spaces. Seeds were catalogued. Specimens were observed. Progress was recorded in careful, professional language across dozens of terminal screens. The tone of those entries changes around the third month. The first signs were physical. Residents reported itching, minor at first, focused around the neck and forearms. Then came disrupted sleep. Then the entries grew shorter. Then one scientist documented the progression in clinical terms for several weeks before the words simply stopped. The researchers who had been studying how to grow things became the material through which something grew. A fungal organism, carried in through the vault's own plant specimens, consumed its hosts from the inside while keeping their bodies mobile. The result moves through Vault 22's lower halls on legs that once belonged to scientists. It carries nothing from those people except the shape. What the vault was built to preserve became the soil for something with no interest in preservation at all. Far from the desert, sealed beneath heavily irradiated ground in the eastern ruins, another vault was running a different kind of test. Vault 87 was not designed to study plants or food. It was designed to study something far more direct. The forced evolutionary virus, FEV, was introduced to the facility's population as the primary subject of research. The residents did not agree to this. Surviving records suggest most of them did not know until it was far too late. What came out of Vault 87's chambers looks different from every other supermutant documented across the wider ruins. The skin is darker, the scarring runs deeper and covers more surface area. The body carries a kind of damage that specimens from the Western settlements simply do not show. Bethesda's development team applied distinct textures and behavior settings to separate this Eastern strain from its California counterpart, a visual and mechanical distinction that was intentional and documented. What was never documented was the silence. Players exploring the Capital Wasteland noticed something the official law never addressed. Vault 87 supermutants do not speak, not in fragments, not in broken sentences, not at all. Western supermutants, those produced through the Mariposa strain of FEV, retain speech. They form words. Some of them form arguments. The Vault 87 strain took something else entirely. The conclusion that spread through years of player observation, that the Eastern FEV destroyed the language centers of the brain, while the Western version left them intact, was never confirmed by any in-game source. No terminal entry addresses it. No character explains it. It became accepted as fact through the weight of its own silence. 200 years underground produced a version of the mutation that could no longer say what had been done to it. South of the eastern ruins, in the territory once called Massachusetts, a vault ran a quieter kind of test. Vault 81 presented itself as a standard facility, residents, corridors, lighting that still worked after 2 centuries. What it did not present was the hidden research wing, accessible only through a specific sequence of events. Down there, behind doors that were not on any resident's map, mole rats had been deliberately infected with diseases. Not accidentally, not as a side effect of poor containment. The infections were designed. The diseases were introduced on purpose, so that the cures could be harvested from the animal's tissue. One terminal entry, written by a researcher named Burrow, reads, Subject 7 shows signs of awareness, adjusting dosage. Subject 7 is never mentioned again. The diseased mole rats that now occupy that hidden wing carry something permanent. Contact with them reduces a person's maximum health, not temporarily, not until treated, permanently. This mechanic exists nowhere else in the game. No other creature in the Commonwealth produces damage that cannot be fully reversed. What Vault 81's scientists designed as a controlled medical system became something that takes from every person who finds it and keeps what it takes. The dosage was adjusted. Whatever Subject 7 became after that adjustment is still in those corridors, smaller than the surface version, slower, but carrying something inside it that no one who encounters it leaves without. Further east, in a vault the surface world had largely forgotten, residents were being studied in a different way. Vault 92 was not interested in plants, or viruses, or animal tissue. It was interested in the human mind. Specifically, it was interested in what happened to a human mind when exposed to carefully calibrated white noise frequencies over an extended period. The residents chosen for this experiment were musicians, people whose sensitivity to sound made them ideal subjects for a study in how audio could be used to trigger psychological responses. What it triggered, eventually, was violent psychotic episodes. Then something else. Then the vault went quiet, in the way that vaults go quiet when there is no one left to maintain the silence deliberately. The feral ghouls inside Vault 92 are the musicians. Their ghoulification was accelerated by the sustained psychological damage of the experiment. Stress on that scale does things to the body that radiation alone does not always accomplish. What makes them distinct from every other feral ghoul documented in the Eastern Ruins is something the sound design team built into the game, and almost no one noticed without headphones. The white noise frequency used in Vault 92's ambient audio track, the actual in-game sound of the Vault's environment, was layered into the idle vocalization of the ghouls inside that specific location. Outside the Vault, the same ghoul type makes a different sound. Inside, the creatures that the frequency destroyed still carry it, still emit it. The thing that broke them became the sound they make. North of the collapsed cities, in the forested mountains of Appalachia, something stands at the edge of Flatwoods and watches. The Flatwoods monster was built with a passive observation mode, a behavioral system that allowed it to position itself at a distance from a target and simply remain there, unmoving, without engaging. This much is visible in the released version of Fallout 76. What the released version does not contain is what the observation was supposed to lead to. Cut content recovered from the game's files reveals that the original design included an abduction mechanic. The creature would watch, then it would take. Players would be transported briefly to a small, isolated space before being released at a different point on the map. The abduction was removed before the game launched. The watching was not. What remains is a creature that positions itself at the tree line and holds its distance with a consistency that feels considered. It does not approach. It does not retreat. It simply maintains the gap between itself and whatever it has decided to observe. The reason the abduction mechanic was removed is not documented in any public development record. The watching behavior that replaced it, or rather, that remained when the rest was stripped away, has no explanation attached to it. Something in the mountains watches. No one recorded what it was looking for. Deeper in Appalachian territory, a vault that was meant to grow things flooded instead. Vault 94 was designed around a different version of the agricultural idea, not food science, but ecological restoration. Residents were selected to cultivate plant species that could eventually be reintroduced to the damaged landscape outside, slowly returning life to soil that the bombs had stripped. The vault's lower levels were garden spaces, the upper levels were living quarters. For a period, the design functioned. Then the water came in, and the design stopped mattering. The feral ghouls in Vault 94's flooded sections carry something visible that most ghouls do not. Their skin holds a greenish-grey tint from long-term submersion. That part is expected, the color of things that have been underwater long enough. What is less expected is the plant matter embedded in their torsos, stems, root structures, material from the vault's gardens, pressed into and partially through the tissue of the former residents. The art team added this detail as environmental texture, a way of making the location feel specific. What players found when they noticed it was something the design team had not explicitly intended to communicate. The vault's plants had fulfilled the mission. Growth had been achieved. The gardens had spread into the people who were supposed to tend them, and in doing so, had accomplished exactly what Vault 94 was built for, in the only direction still available. Below the ruins of Boston, in a facility that calls itself the Institute, a manufacturing floor runs without pause. Generation 1 synths are built here. Skeletal frames, mechanical joints, a form that makes no attempt to resemble anything biological. The Institute classifies them as tools, workers, objects with functions rather than histories. This classification is maintained consistently across every official Institute document. They are produced, assigned, and replaced without ceremony, because the official position is that ceremony would be misapplied to something that does not require it. cut terminal entries from the manufacturing floor tell a slightly different story. Early Generation 1 units, in the period shortly after the production line was established, displayed an unexpected pattern. Units would stop mid-task and stand motionless for periods ranging from minutes to several hours before resuming normal operation. Technicians logged the behavior as a processing error. Diagnostic cycles were run. No cause was identified. The behavior was eventually resolved, patched out of the production line, before the game's final version shipped. In the released game, Generation 1 synths move without interruption. They do not stop. They do not stand. Except one. A unit designated M762, stationed on the sub-level manufacturing floor, still does it. It stops in the middle of a task. It stands. After a period with no documented duration, it resumes. No quest in the game addresses this. No character in the Institute acknowledges it. The patch that removed the behavior from every other unit on the floor did not remove it from M762. Whether this was an oversight or something else, the game provides no answer. The unit stops. It stands in the middle of the floor where things are built. Then it continues building them. Everything the sealed facilities created, the mobile remains of researchers, the mute giants, the animals that take permanently, the musicians who hum the frequency that ended them, the watcher in the trees, the garden that grew into its gardeners, the machine that pauses for reasons no diagnostic ever found, was a result of controlled conditions producing uncontrolled outcomes. The vaults measured everything. They accounted for almost nothing that mattered. The road rises now, back toward open air, back toward heat and dust, and the particular quiet of the Mojave, where the creatures living under that damaged sky were not engineered by anyone. They arrived the way everything in the desert arrives, slowly, without announcement, shaped by the specific pressure of a place that does not forgive inefficiency. There is a road north of Jacobstown that nobody uses anymore. It is not blocked. It is not collapsed. The asphalt is cracked but passable, and the mountain view from that stretch of highway is, by the Mojave's standards, almost beautiful. People stopped using it because of what lives along the approach. Not because of what those things do when they find you, though that is bad enough. Because of how they do it. Because the first group hits, and you survive, and you breathe, and you think it is finished. And then the second group arrives, and you understand, standing on that quiet road with the mountain ahead of you, that something out here understood patience before you did. The Mojave did not create monsters. It created something more specific than that. It created things that had learned, over 200 years of open desert, exactly how to use the space around them. The Cazador near the Jacobstown approach is not the largest threat in the Mojave. It is not even close. It is a wasp, enormous by any reasonable standard, with a wingspan that throws a shadow, and a stinger built for something much bigger than an insect ought to be targeting. But in a landscape that contains death claws and irradiated bears and things pulled from military laboratories, a wasp registers initially as a manageable problem. The placement of cazadors along the mountain road was a design decision. Obsidian's team wanted Jacobstown, a settlement of super mutants living in deliberate isolation, to feel genuinely cut off from the rest of the region. A natural barrier of hostile creatures around the approach served that purpose. The cazadors were positioned at intervals along the road, spaced apart enough to create coverage across the full length of the approach. What the spacing created, unintentionally, was timing. The groups do not spawn close enough together to engage simultaneously. The first cluster finds a target and attacks. The second cluster, positioned further back along the road, registers the combat, but takes longer to close the distance. By the time the first group is dealt with, the second is almost in range, but not quite. There is a gap, a breath. Enough space for a person to believe the road is clear. The second wave arrives into that belief and ends it. No behavior flag in the game's code scripted this sequence. It emerged from geometry and spawn distance. The mountain kept its settlement hidden behind insects that had accidentally learned to take turns. Southeast of the mountain road, past the long stretches of broken highway that connect the Mojave's scattered points of civilization, a cave sits in the rock above the desert floor. Bloodborne Cave does not announce itself. The entrance is narrow, the interior dark, and the creatures inside, night stalkers, are not immediately visible from the opening. The night stalker is a hybrid, rattlesnake and coyote, combined through the Big MT research program's genetic work and released through various means of containment failure into the open desert. It has the body shape of a canine and the scale pattern of a serpent, and the behavioral characteristics of neither parent species. It moves with a low, fluid motion that does not belong to either animal it came from. In life, it is difficult to categorize. In death, it does something no other creature in New Vegas does. It coils. Every other creature in the game collapses outward when killed. The body goes down and spreads. The Night Stalker's death animation pulls inward. The body curves toward its own center, legs drawing in, the serpentine neck describing a curve that a coyote's body would never make. One animator, whose initials appear in the relevant file's metadata as RT, built this animation deliberately. The coiling reflects the snake component of the hybrid's biology, the snake half of its parentage dying the way snakes die, regardless of what the rest of the body looks like. One person's decision about biological accuracy left a permanent mark on how a creature that should not exist dies in a cave in the Nevada desert. Further south, in the flat scrubland surrounding the Repcon test site, something moves through the dry grass with a particular kind of stillness between movements. The giant mantis is large enough to be visible at a distance. It is not, by most measures, subtle. Its coloring blends with the dead vegetation of the open Mojave, better than might be expected, and it holds a position between movements long enough that the eye can lose it against the background if the distance is right. But it is not invisible. It is simply patient in a way that makes it easy to misread as absent. What makes the mantis genuinely strange is what it produces. The forelegs, large, serrated, built for catching, drop as a crafting ingredient when the creature is killed. The ingredient is used in the construction of stealth buoys, the devices that render a person temporarily invisible. No in-game document explains how an insect limb contributes to a personal cloaking mechanism. A crafting recipe lists it as a component without elaboration. Data recovered from early build files shows that mantis forelegs were originally tagged as a consumable food item under the label mantis meat. The change to a crafting ingredient happened late in production. The lore connecting the limb to the technology was never written. Someone in the Mojave, at some point between the bombs and the present, looked at the foreleg of a giant insect and understood something about invisibility that no surviving document records. The quarry at the base of the mountain range was once an active operation. Workers extracted stone from quarry junction through a process that required machinery, coordination, and the consistent presence of human labor. The records of when that labor stopped are not precise. The dates in surviving documents do not agree, but the reason it stopped is not in dispute. Deathclaws moved in, not one, a colony. They occupied the quarry floor, the access roads, the machinery left in place when the workers ran. They have been there since. They are there now. Mojave deathclaws are visually lighter than the versions documented in the eastern ruins or the northern Commonwealth. The coloration difference was noted in early player comparisons between Fallout 3 and New Vegas, and has never been officially attributed to a specific biological cause. More significant than the color is the behavior. Deathclaws in the Capital Wasteland pursue without limit. A target that runs is a target that is followed, regardless of distance. The same pattern holds in the Commonwealth. Quarry Junction's colony does not do this. There is a boundary. It is not marked by anything physical, no fence, no terrain feature, no visible line. But the animals stop at it, every time. A target that crosses a certain distance from the quarry's edge is simply no longer pursued. Whether this is territorial instinct carried forward from the Jackson's chameleon genetics that contributed to the Deathclaw's original engineering, chameleons hold defined ranges and rarely leave them, has never been confirmed by any source. The quarry is theirs. Everything within a certain radius of it is theirs. Everything outside that radius is, by some decision no one designed into them, not their concern. At the edge of Lake Mead, where the pre-war reservoir still holds water that glows faintly in certain lights, something stands upright in the shallows and screams. The lake lurk is a catfish that 200 years of irradiated water turned into something that walks. The body retains the wide, flat head and the pale underbelly of its original species. The posture does not. It stands on rear limbs, developed through generations of mutation, and when it opens its mouth, the sound that comes out was built in a recording studio from a slowed and pitch-adjusted human scream. The sound design team needed something aquatic. They also needed something that would produce fear at a frequency the brain did not consciously recognize as familiar. The human scream, processed down to the lake lurk's register, retains just enough of its original quality to register as distress without registering as human. Players documented this separately and consistently. The sound near Lake Mead affected them in a way disproportionate to the creature's visual threat level. Something at the water's edge was calling out in a frequency that older parts of the brain filed under a category they could not name. West of the lake, in the canyon country near Red Rock, the Great Khans have held territory for as long as anyone in this part of the desert can remember. The canyon approaches carry the markers of their occupation: painted rock, positioned supplies, the general evidence of a group that has decided this particular stretch of stone belongs to them. The bighorners that graze near the canyon approaches sometimes spawn sick, not injured, not aggressive from proximity. Sick in a way that manifests as a turning inward. They move slowly, strike at other members of the herd before they turn outward, behave as though something they consumed is working against them from inside. This is a random flag in the spawn data, not a scripted story. But the location placed this behavior directly beside a faction defined by chemical dependency, a group whose relationship with jet and other substances had, over generations, produced a culture organized partly around what those substances did to people. The animals near the Khan camp were also turning on their own. The canyon's particular chemistry had reached everything that lived within it. Closer to Quarry Junction, on the flat ground surrounding Sloan, fire geckos move through the scrub at night, and something along their dorsal ridge glows. The glow is not in their base design. The fire gecko's standard texture does not include a bioluminescent element. What players observed near Sloan, a faint, pulsing orange light running the length of the creature's spine after dark, is a lighting engine artifact. The game's rendering system, in proximity to the fire sources placed throughout Quarry Junction's environmental design, applied a persistent light emission to the creatures in the surrounding area that was not cleared when those creatures moved beyond the light's actual range. The result is a gecko that carries a glow that does not belong to it, generated by a technical error, visible only at night, in a specific radius, around a specific location. Players who saw it assumed it was biology. They assumed the desert had produced an animal with its own internal light source. They assumed this because the Mojave had already produced enough genuinely strange things that one more made sense. The error looked like evolution. The desert had been producing real versions of that same thing for 200 years, and the difference between a real adaptation and a rendering mistake is not always visible from the outside. The Mojave did not ask anything of its creatures. It simply applied pressure, heat, isolation, radiation, time, and noted what remained. What remained was patient and territorial, and occasionally glowing for reasons that required no explanation to persist. The road north leads out of the desert now. The air changes. The ruins get denser. The sky over the Commonwealth is a different color than the sky over the Mojave. Heavier, lower, as though the accumulated weight of a collapsed city is pressing it down. The creatures there were not shaped by open space and sun. They were shaped by concrete and technology, and the specific horror of an urban landscape that never fully emptied. Boston did not empty after the bombs. Every other major city in the wasteland hollowed out in some way. The population died or fled or transformed beyond recognition, and what remained was architecture without inhabitants. Boston kept something, not people exactly. Not the civilization that had filled those towers and walked those streets and eaten lunch along the river, but something that remembered the shape of all of that. Something that went back to the upper floors of the buildings it used to live in, and stood at the windows, and looked out at a city that no longer had any use for what it was doing. The Commonwealth's creatures are not simply animals that moved into abandoned space. Several of them are the space. They are what the city became when it stopped being a city and started being something else. Something that runs on different rules, follows different patterns, and has been doing so long enough that the patterns feel, from the outside, almost intentional. Back Bay was expensive before the war. The buildings along its streets were tall, well-maintained, occupied by people who had chosen a specific kind of urban life. High floors, city views, the particular status of an address that announced something about who lived there. The bombs did not bring those buildings down. The structures are still standing. The upper floors are still accessible. Something still occupies them. Feral ghouls in the Commonwealth move faster than the version documented in the eastern ruins during the years following the war. This was a deliberate change. The design team increased speed and aggression between the two games, making the Commonwealth version a meaningfully different encounter. But the Back Bay ghouls have a characteristic the adjustment did not create. They congregate on upper floors, not ground level, not mid-building, high up, near the windows, in the spaces that were once the most valuable parts of those structures. When something enters the building below, they descend. The descent is fast and direct, but the starting position is always up. Whether the building geometry produces this as a pathfinding result, upper floors being the last accessible spaces that remained unobstructed, or whether something in the ghoulification process left a residual pull toward where these individuals once lived, has never been addressed by any official source. Both explanations are possible. The result is the same either way. Back Bay's upper floors are occupied. The things that occupy them do not know why they went back. They went back anyway. Faneuil Hall was a marketplace before the war. Vendors, foot traffic, the organized commerce of a city that still believed in the value of gathered people exchanging things of value. The hall's interior is large enough to hold significant numbers. It holds them now in a different configuration. Feral ghouls, drawn to the enclosed space the way the Commonwealth's ghouls are often drawn to interiors, filling the hall in the approximate density of a crowd. Among them is a glowing one. Glowing ones are feral ghouls whose radiation absorption has reached a level that makes them sources rather than just recipients. They emit rather than simply carry. The mechanic attached to this in Fallout 4 allows them to release a radiation burst that revives nearby ghouls who have been brought down in combat. The burst was implemented as a simple area effect. When a downed ghoul is caught in it, the creature returns to an active state. The development team built this as a restoration mechanic. The glowing one returns its companions to the fight. What the team did not build was a stat reset on revival. The ghouls inside Faneuil Hall that are brought back through a glowing one's burst return with slightly higher health and marginally increased movement speed than they had before being downed. The radiation did not simply restart them, it improved what it restarted. A missing flag in the revival code produced an implication that no designer documented as intentional, that the glowing one is not restoring its companions to what they were. It is returning them as something incrementally better. The hall that once held a marketplace now holds a process. The process runs on radiation. It is, by every measurable outcome, working. The castle sits on a point of land jutting into the water south of the city. It was a fort before the war, then a base of operations, then a ruin, then something in between. The moat surrounding its outer walls holds water. The water holds Mirelurks. And somewhere in the deeper section of that moat, a Mirelurk king has established a position it does not leave. The king's sonic attack, the primary tool that distinguishes it from the standard Mirelurk, was assembled from 3 recorded sources. A whale call provided the base frequency. A slowed human exhale was layered over it. A synthesizer tone used in submarine sonar technology was added beneath both. The combined result sits partially outside the range of comfortable human hearing. It is audible, but part of its frequency operates below the threshold, where the brain processes sound consciously, and above the threshold, where the body stops registering it physically. Players who encountered the Mirelurk King at the castle documented the sound as uncomfortable in a way that other creature audio was not. Not louder, not more complex, simply wrong at a frequency that did not have a name. The sound team recorded this response during testing and confirmed it was the intended outcome. The king's voice was not designed to frighten in the conventional sense. It was designed to reach below the part of the brain that evaluates threats rationally and land in something that has been registering certain sounds as dangerous since long before rational evaluation existed. Upstream from the castle, where the Charles River runs past the ruins of Cambridge, soft-shell maralurks move through shallow water near what was once MIT's riverside research infrastructure. The Institute, the facility that now occupies the space MIT left behind, is known for its work on synthetic life. What is less prominently documented is what MIT was doing to the Charles River before the bombs fell. Pre-war terminal entries recovered from the Riverside facilities reference water quality studies that flagged unusual mutation rates in the river's crustacean population years before the war ended. The river was already changing. The studies noted it. The studies continued. No corrective action is recorded. The softshell miralurks in the Cambridge stretch of the river are not post-war mutations in the strict sense. Their predecessors were already diverging from baseline crustacean biology before the bombs introduced radiation into the calculation. The Institute constructed itself above a river. Its predecessor institution had been quietly altering for decades. The miralurks patrolling that stretch of water are the continuation of a process that MIT started and the Institute inherited without acknowledging. The river changed because something upstream decided to study it. The things in the river are the result of that study. They have been the result of it for 2 centuries, and they will continue to be the result of it for as long as the river runs. Southwest of the city, where the land flattens into the swamp territory surrounding Natick banks, stingwings hunt in a pattern that does not vary. The stingwing is a dragonfly expanded by radiation into something the size of a large dog, with a tail stinger built for a target considerably larger than any insect should be targeting. In most of the Commonwealth, they hunt as individual threats, or loose clusters, without predictable formation. Near Natick banks, the pattern is fixed. 3 approach from above. 1 comes from ground level. The arrangement is consistent across every documented encounter at this location. Bethesda placed the spawn points at these specific coordinates for difficulty management. The arrangement was meant to create a balanced but challenging encounter at a location players reach at a particular point in their exploration of the southwestern area. The arrangement also looks, from the target's perspective, like something that was planned. 3 angles from above, 1 from ground level, converging simultaneously. A creature with no higher cognitive function, approaching in a formation that a tactically minded person might draw on a map before an operation. Players who survived the encounter and analyzed it afterward documented the sensation of having been surrounded by something that had rehearsed. They had not been. The geometry of 4 spawn points had simply produced, in a swamp outside a flooded town, the appearance of coordination. The appearance was convincing enough that the distinction barely mattered. High above the street level, on the upper floors of Trinity Tower, super mutants have built something resembling a stronghold. The floors below their occupation are accessible but contested. The floors they control are loud and heavily populated. In the corners, in the gaps between larger threats, something much smaller moves. Radroaches, in Fallout 4, are listed in the game's item data as producing bloatfly meat when killed. This is a remnant of an early development build in which both creatures shared a loot table before being separated into distinct entries. The table separation happened. The loot tag on the radroach did not update to reflect it. The error persisted into the released game without correction. Radroaches on Trinity Tower's upper floors, the same floors where super mutants have established their highest point of control, drop, on death, a meat product that their biology cannot generate. Players who collected and cooked it received the standard nutritional result associated with bloatfly tissue. The smallest creature in the tower was providing something it had no biological mechanism to produce, and the game's cooking system accepted this without comment. The food chain in the Commonwealth had stopped following the rules that food chains are supposed to follow. Trinity Tower was simply one of the more visible places where this was happening. North of the city, where the coastline breaks into rocky outcroppings above the Atlantic, Kingsport Lighthouse stands on the cliff edge. Near it, something white moves through the fog. The albino deathclaw is a rare variant. Its lack of pigmentation gives it a pale grey-white coloration that, in the Commonwealth's frequently overcast coastal conditions, is genuinely difficult to track visually. Fog and low cloud cover, common along this stretch of the coast, reduce contrast to a degree that makes a white-grey shape against a white-grey background something close to invisible at distance. The design team built the albino variant with this environmental advantage as an intentional element. What the team also built, in an earlier version of the variant, was a compensating disadvantage. The albino's lack of pigmentation was meant to extend to its eyes, an absence of the melanin that protects visual systems from light sensitivity, producing functional blindness in the same conditions that made it hard to see. The deathclaw, that could not be easily spotted, would also not be able to spot easily. A balance. The blindness mechanic was removed before release. The coloration remained. The cliff above Kingsport now holds something that cannot be clearly seen in the conditions that most commonly occur there, and that sees, in those same conditions, without any limitation at all. The trade-off that was supposed to make it fair was taken out. What remained was one half of a design that had been built to be balanced. The city's ruins did not simply provide shelter for what moved through them. They provided pressure, the density, the vertical space, the water, the swamp, the cliff, and the creatures took the shape of whatever pressure they were given. Boston did not empty, it reorganized. Everything that came after the bombs filled the space that the city's original occupants left behind, and settled into it with a thoroughness that, from a distance, could almost be mistaken for belonging there. The fog thickens ahead, the coast curves north. The road to Far Harbor begins where the mainland's certainty ends, and what lives inside that particular mist has been developing without any mainland observer for long enough that the differences are no longer small. There is a campground on Far Harbor that still looks occupied. 3 lights burn in the mist, arranged in a triangle, the way lanterns get arranged when people set up for the night. One near the entrance, one toward the back, one off to the side where someone would put a light if they were cooking. From a distance, moving through the grey wall of fog that covers most of the island, those 3 lights look like safety. They look like other people. They look like the one thing the island rarely offers. A place where someone is already awake and waiting. Nobody is waiting. The lights are not lanterns. What is producing them has been producing them for a long time, and it has been producing them specifically because things moving through the fog tend to walk toward light. Far Harbor does not hide its dangers, it decorates them. The fog on this island is not ordinary weather. It is acidic, chemically active, and older than any settlement currently standing on the coast of Maine. The mutations it has produced are not 2-century-old post-war adaptations locked into a stable form. They are ongoing. The island's creatures are still changing, and the fog crawler near Eagles Cove Tannery is the clearest proof of this. Every major creature in the wider wasteland is understood as a finished product of the bombs, something that mutated in the years following the war and arrived at the form it now holds. The fog crawler broke this understanding. Island residents remember when they were smaller, not rumors, not inherited stories passed from grandparents through 2 generations of retelling, living memory. People alive at the time of this story recall fog crawlers at roughly half their current size. Terminal entries at Eagles Cove support this, recording measurements from 5 years prior that match resident accounts. The fog is still accelerating something in those bodies. The process that produced the fog crawler has not reached a conclusion. Whatever the end point of that acceleration looks like, the island has not reached it yet. What stands near the tannery ruins now is not the finished version of the fog crawler. It is an intermediate stage. The next version is still coming, west along the coastline, where the road curves toward Brooks Head Lighthouse. Gulpers congregate near the water's edge, in numbers that make the approach to the light genuinely difficult. The gulper is a salamander, taken in a direction that salamanders were not designed to go. Amphibious still, low to the ground, but scaled up and equipped with a jaw mechanism that functions as a primary offensive tool. Its swallowing attack produces a brief loss of orientation for whatever it catches before depositing the target nearby. This is the attack players notice. What most players do not notice is what the gulper does between attacks. Its idle animation includes a periodic throat convulsion, a swallowing motion, performed without anything in the mouth at irregular intervals. The throat moves, the jaw works slightly, nothing passes through. Whether this is an animation loop running without a trigger condition or a deliberate behavioral choice by the team is not addressed in any available development record. What it produces, at Brooks Head, is audible across a significant distance in fog conditions. The swallowing sound travels further than the creature's visible outline. Something near the lighthouse is practicing a motion it intends to use before it can be seen doing it. The island announces what is coming. It does not announce it clearly. Further inland, at the National Park campground, 3 anglers have taken positions that nobody arranged with any intention. The angler is built around mimicry. A plant growth on the creature's head produces bioluminescent light. Warm, yellowish, the approximate color of a lantern or a flame. In fog, where light sources are the primary navigation tool, this glow functions as an advertisement aimed at anything looking for safety or other people. The angler waits. Things come toward the light. The rest follows. At the campground, 3 anglers were placed by the level design team at positions calculated for enemy density across the area. The positions were not chosen to create a visual effect. They were chosen because they covered the campground's interior evenly. The result of those 3 positions, viewed from the approach trail through fog, is a triangle of warm lights, arranged the way people arrange lights when they make camp. 1 near the front, 1 toward the rear, 1 off to the side. The spacing matches what a small group would produce if they were trying to light a space for cooking and sleeping. No traveler designed that arrangement. 3 spawn coordinates produced it. The campground has looked inhabited ever since, except that what is doing the inhabiting has been there longer than any genuine camp could have lasted, and will be there long after the fog closes in again. Below the cliffs where Acadia stands, on the lower coastal path that runs along the island's rockier stretches, a synth researcher wrote a single terminal entry about something observed from above. The entry calls it a trap jaw variant. The jaw structure, the researcher notes, is elongated beyond anything in the standard Miralurk body plan. Not a growth of the existing mandible, but a restructuring of the lower face into something with a different functional purpose. The creature had, according to the entry, built a den from the hull of a wrecked fishing boat below the path. It had arranged interior material. The researcher observed it for long enough to conclude the arrangement was deliberate. The trapjaw variant appears in no official creature record for Far Harbor. No model entry, no spawn data, no loot table. The terminal entry is the only place it exists in any form. Players who read it and went looking on the coastal path below found, in some cases, a Miralurk that moved and responded differently from others nearby. Most found nothing unusual. The coastal path offers no confirmation. The entry does not promise any. It simply records what one researcher saw from a clifftop, in enough detail to suggest they believed what they were looking at, and then says nothing further about it. North of Acadia, along the road that runs past the Vim Pop Factory, bloodbugs move through the air, in sizes the mainland version of the same creature does not reach. Far Harbor's bloodbugs are large. The proboscis, the feeding organ, is correspondingly larger, built to the scale of the body carrying it. When killed, they drop a bloodbug proboscis, the same item their much smaller Commonwealth counterparts produce. The item weight is identical, 0.1 pounds. The game's crafting system does not register the size of the animal that produced the proboscis, only the category of item it falls under. A feeding organ from a creature the size of a large dog weighs exactly as much as a feeding organ from a creature the size of a house cat. The island's fog and radiation grew something measurably larger than the mainland produced. The economy of the wasteland assigned it the same value anyway. What Far Harbor had spent years enlarging, the crafting table evaluated as unchanged. The Vim Factory's exterior where these creatures are most heavily concentrated, sits near a building that spent decades producing a product marketed as making people feel bigger and stronger. The irony of scale running through that stretch of road is not something any design document created. It arrived through proximity and coincidence, the way most of Far Harbor's meanings seem to arrive. The nucleus sits on the island's northeastern edge, a submarine base converted into a place of worship by the children of Atom, a group for whom radiation is not damage but divinity. The sub-pens are their cathedral, the outer approaches are their threshold, and at that threshold, something white stands in the fog and does not move unless approached. The albino fog crawler, outside the nucleus, is flagged in the game's encounter data with a tag reading, "Sacred Creature, Do Not Remove." This tag was placed by a developer and preserved through the release build without removal or revision. The children of Atom built their holiest location beside the fog. The fog produced its largest, palest creation and placed it at the entrance. Whether the development team intended the tag as a narrative statement, the creature as an environmental expression of the faction's beliefs, or as a practical instruction to level designers not to clear the spawn for difficulty balancing, the result is the same either way. The group that worships what radiation does has, outside their most sacred space, the largest thing radiation made on this island. It stands there. It has been standing there. The tag says it should not be moved. Nothing has moved it. Near the Harbour Master Hotel ruins, something crosses the road slowly enough that a person would have time to stop and look at what it is carrying. The building hermit crab is exactly what the name describes. A hermit crab that outgrew available shells and found larger housing. The structure on its back is a pre-war residential building, not a fragment, not a partial wall, but a recognizable structure with intact windows and furniture visible through the glass on the lower floors. It moves with the building balanced on its carapace, crossing the island's roads and rocky ground with the unhurried pace of something that does not experience its load as a burden. What the windows show, to anyone who stops long enough to look, is an interior that was arranged by people. A chair near a window, a table, objects placed at heights and positions that make sense only if the person placing them expected to use them while standing upright. People lived in that building. They arranged what was inside it according to how they intended to use the space. The crab does not know this. It found housing that fit. It has been carrying other people's home across Far Harbour ever since, and whatever was left inside has been travelling with it. The fog did not hide what it was growing. It grew too slowly for anyone to track the changes in real time, and by the time the changes were visible, they had already been underway long enough that stopping them was no longer a question anyone on the island was asking. The road south leads away from the coast and into something entirely different. Neon signs, broken roller coasters, the rusted skeleton of a place that was built to produce happiness and has been producing other things, in the dark, ever since the last paying customer left. The bottling line at Nuka World's production plant is still running, not metaphorically, not as a remnant of a system winding down. The line moves. Bottles advance along the track, fill with liquid, get capped, and continue forward. The process that was designed before the war to fill containers with a product and send them out into the world is executing that design right now in a building that has not had a human employee in roughly 2 centuries. The bottles come off the line, they go into crates. The crates sit in a loading area where no truck has arrived to collect them in a very long time. This would be an interesting relic of automated pre-war engineering on its own. What makes it something else is what the filling tanks contain. The liquid in the production pools is not the original formula. It is irradiated, chemically altered by 200 years of sealed exposure, and inhabited. Something lives in those tanks, something that has been living in them long enough to change color to match what surrounds it. The bottles being produced in that facility are being filled from pools where creatures nest. Nuka World's factory never stopped making its product. It simply changed what goes into it. The Nuka Lurk is a mirror lurk, a crustacean mutation of the type found along waterways across the eastern ruins. that has spent enough generations submerged in irradiated Nuka-Cola to alter its shell coloration to a luminescent teal. The shells glow faintly. The production pools glow around them. The bottling line moves overhead, filling containers from the same tanks where these animals rest between movements. No pre-war quality control process accounted for this. The automated system does not check what the liquid contains before it fills a bottle. It checks volume and temperature and seal integrity, because those were the variables the original engineers thought to measure. The presence of a large, irradiated crustacean in the source material was not a variable anyone built a test for. The line passes the bottles go into crates. The crates accumulate in a room where nothing has been collected in 200 years. The Nukalurk became part of a production process it did not apply to join, and the process accepted it without adjustment. Across the park, past the broken Midway games and the collapsed ride structures, the Robco Battlezone Arena occupies a building that was designed for exactly one thing: combat entertainment. Crowds were meant to fill the stands. Combatants were meant to perform inside the ring. The experience was engineered to produce excitement in observers. The Rust Devils, a raider group operating within Nuka World, brought repurposed robots to the arena and modified them for combat. Cut quest files from the game's development reveal that a full storyline was planned around the battle zone, allowing players to reprogram these robots and enter them in organized bouts. The quest line was removed. The robots were not. They remained in the arena with their combat programming intact and no narrative framework to explain why they are still fighting. What remains in the battle zone are machines that attack in sequences, pause between engagements, and resume on intervals that match the rhythm of a structured bout rather than a standard combat encounter. They are not fighting randomly. They are performing a format. The stands are empty. The lighting rigs still cycle through colors. The machines run their sequences without any observer present, on a schedule that makes sense only if someone is watching, in a space built entirely around the assumption that someone would always be watching. Nuka World's arena has been running its program for 2 centuries with no audience. The machines have not adjusted their behavior to account for this. Deeper inside the park, in the section called Kiddie Kingdom, the funhouse tunnels were designed to produce confusion. Mirrored surfaces, false corridors, changing floor levels. The architecture was built to disorient anyone moving through it. This was the attraction. Being lost inside was the point. Rad rats live in those tunnels now. They move through the funhouse at speeds and along routes that do not reflect the confusion the architecture was meant to produce. They take direct paths. They do not pause at intersections or double back. The game's AI system, when handling creatures in enclosed spaces with complex geometry, uses pre-calculated navigation routes rather than real-time pathfinding. The rad rats in Kiddie Kingdom are following paths that were calculated when the building's layout was finalized. They know exactly where they are going because the routes were worked out before they arrived. The funhouse was designed to make navigation impossible. The rats navigate it without hesitation. In a building built entirely around the promise of disorientation, the smallest residents are the only things that have never been confused by it. Further into the park's safari adventure section, the exhibit animals are still present. Not all of them are what the original exhibits displayed. The Ghoulrilla, a gorilla that ghoulification transformed into something bipedal and aggressive, was once a zoo animal in the standard sense. Contained, observed, part of a collection. The radiation changed its posture and its temperament. It moves upright now and attacks with a directness the original animal's behavior did not include. What ghoulification did not change is visible in the gaps between combat. When the Ghoulrilla is not engaged, when it believes nothing nearby requires its attention, it occasionally drops onto all 4 limbs. The movement is brief. The posture holds for a few seconds before the creature rises again. The gorilla rig underneath the ghoulified model still carries that motion, and the animation system allows it to surface in the idle state. Players who watched from a safe distance and caught the transition described it in similar terms across many separate reports. It was the moment the monster was briefly just an animal, not threatening, not grotesque, simply resting in the way it rested before any of this happened. The Safari Adventure's old resident, still present in the body of what replaced it, surfacing for a few seconds when nothing is requiring it to be anything else. In the Quantum Production Wing, where Nuka-Cola's premium blue glowing variant was manufactured before the war, a glowing one produces light in the wrong color. Standard glowing ones emit green, the color most associated with radiation in the Fallout universe's visual language, the color of contaminated water, and irradiated flesh and nuclear waste in its most recognizable form. The glowing one, in the Quantum Wing, emits blue, the exact shade of blue that the Quantum product displayed on store shelves, and in advertising, and in the bottles that lined the production racks of this specific building. The game's files label this creature quantum.gadgel.protype. The label was not removed before release. It appears in the data as the development team left it, a working name that became the permanent name because no one cleaned it out before the game shipped. Whether the person inside this creature consumed enough of the product to alter the color of their ghoulification or absorbed the quantum formula through prolonged exposure to the production environment, the game does not address. The label says prototype. The implication is that whatever process produced this creature was not refined enough to be called finished. The Quantum Wing has a ghoul that glows in the building's product color. The file that contains it still uses the name assigned during testing. What it is a prototype of was never specified. At the transit center corrals, behind fencing that was meant to hold exhibit animals for a theme park audience, a Brahmilaf stands in a space too small for what it has become. The Brahmilaf is a hybrid, Brahmin genetics and Yaoguai genetics, combined in a pre-war research context that produced something neither parent species resembles in final form. When killed, it drops both Brahmin meat and Yaoguai roast simultaneously. The crafting system processes these as separate items from separate animals. Recipes that use Brahmin meat treat the Brahmilaf as a cow. Recipes that use Yaoguai roast treat it as an irradiated bear. The same creature, processed through two different culinary traditions, produces two different results from what was, physically, a single animal. Nuka World scientists built something the post-war world's categories could not accommodate. The economy assigned it two identities because one was insufficient. The transit center corrals, which once held animals for a park that no longer has paying visitors, still hold this one. It does not fit neatly into any classification the wasteland uses for the things it eats. It was efficient, in the way that things built without concern for categories often are. In the Nuka Galaxy ride, past the entrance gates and into the interior, where animatronic figures were designed to move along programmed tracks, something in Section C is not moving. 3 figures stand still among the moving ones. They are not on tracks. They are not connected to any electrical system in the building. This was verified by players who checked the surrounding infrastructure and found no power source attached to the 3 static figures. A terminal entry written by a pre-war theme designer reads, "The alien figures in Section C are too realistic. Marketing approved them. I did not." The entry is the only documentation that anyone on staff noticed a difference. The moving figures continue their programmed routes. The 3 still ones stand among them, in positions that place them between the animated figures rather than beside them. They have been in those positions since before the bombs fell. They have been in those positions through 2 centuries of the park, operating without staff or visitors. The ride still runs the sections it can power. The figures that were always still remain still. The designer who wrote that entry is not available to clarify what they meant by too realistic. The 3 figures in Section C offer no clarification of their own. Nuka World was built to fill people with something. The spectacle was the product, the lights, the movement, the noise, the sense of being inside something larger than ordinary life. The park still produces all of these things. It simply produces them now for an audience that was not the intended one, through creatures and machines that inherited the park's capacity for performance without inheriting any understanding of what the performance was for. The lights of the park fall away to the east. The road north runs into darker country, older trees, heavier air, mountains, that were keeping their secrets before Nuka World was built, and will be keeping them long after the last neon sign goes dark. Someone followed the Mothman once, and wrote down where it led them. The notes are incomplete. The locations listed do not form a route that makes sense on a map. Not a straight line, not a spiral, not any arrangement that suggests a destination. The person who wrote the notes followed the creature for 3 hours across Appalachian terrain, before losing it near a ridge they could not identify from their current position. They wrote, "It knew I was behind it. It kept the same distance the entire time. I do not think it was leading me somewhere. I think it was showing me how far I was willing to go." The notes end there. The ridge is not identified. The Mothman was gone by the time whoever was writing decided to stop. West Virginia's mountains have been producing things like this for 2 centuries. Things that move with intention and leave no explanation behind them. The question of whether that intention belongs to the creature or to the person following it is one the mountains have never answered directly. Point Pleasant was famous for the Mothman before the war. The legend was old enough to have museums, merchandise, festivals built around it. Whatever originally produced the sightings that became the legend is not something the historical record clarifies. What Fallout 76 placed in Point Pleasant's town square is a creature with 3 behavioral modes coded into its AI: passive observation, active aggression, and a 3rd mode, labeled Profit, in the game's files. The Profit mode was intended to direct players toward events or locations, a creature that functioned as an environmental guide, moving with purpose towards something worth finding. The mode was cut before launch. The trigger that activates it was not. Under specific server conditions, a full moon event active, a player's health below a certain level, the Mothman enters the Profit behavioral pattern briefly before reverting to its standard settings. It moves. It moves with the directness the mode was built to produce. Then the trigger expires, and the movement stops. Players who noticed this and followed the creature during those windows documented the locations it moved toward. The locations vary. No consistent destination has been confirmed across multiple recorded instances. The mountain sends something in a direction. The direction changes. The code for where the creature was supposed to lead people is no longer present. Only the behavior of leaving remains, in brief windows, pointing somewhere that the game no longer contains a reason to go. East of Point Pleasant, in the industrial territory surrounding Grafton, a creature moves through the streets of a collapsed city with a silhouette that takes a moment to process correctly. The Grafton monster is large and roughly humanoid, but the outline is wrong in a specific way. The shoulders are present, the torso is present. Above the shoulders, where a head should continue the shape upward, nothing continues. The creature was designed without one. A visual decision, rooted in West Virginia cryptid tradition, producing something that reads as deeply wrong to a brain that expects a certain arrangement of body parts and finds one component absent. What the design team kept, despite removing the head, was the hit detection zone for it. The invisible space above the Grafton monster's shoulders is still registered by the game's systems as a head. Players who target that space receive the same critical damage bonus they would receive from a successful headshot on any other creature. The head that is not there still functions as a head in every mechanical sense. Something was taken out of the model. The underlying structure that the model was built on top of retained what was removed. The Grafton monster's absent head is still present in everything except appearance, still absorbing damage, still fulfilling a role in a face that does not exist. South of Grafton, in the small settlement called Flatwoods, a church building served as the Responders' local base of operations. The Responders were Appalachia's pre-collapse emergency services, the people who were supposed to help when things went wrong. The terminals in the church record their activity in the area: supply runs, medical assistance, notes about the local population. They also record something else: power fluctuations with no identified source, supply caches found empty without any sign of forced access, and a single entry that reads, "Something came into the camp last night. Nothing was taken, nothing was harmed. I don't know what it wanted." The entries stop 3 days after that one. Not abruptly. There are 2 more entries after it, both brief, both focused on other operational matters. Then nothing. The responders at Flatwoods did not record an attack. They did not record a confrontation. The Flatwoods monster, which appears in the clearing near the church, did not destroy the organization that left those notes. What it did during those visits to the camp, what it was doing near the supply caches, near the equipment, near the people who wrote those entries, the records do not say. The thing that came into the camp left nothing behind except the uncertainty of an entry that asked what it wanted and received no answer. Northwest of Flatwoods, at Billings Homestead, things are not where they were left. The snallygaster is a predator, large, fast, built for catching things that are trying not to be caught. After a kill, it moves the body. Not immediately away from the kill site, but to a specific distance from its own spawn location, before consuming what it caught. This was built into the creature's behavior to make it feel territorial. A predator that maintains a defined relationship between where it lives and where it feeds. The design note said territorial. The result said something slightly different. Players who returned to areas where snallygasters were present found bodies in positions they did not leave them in. An NPC killed during a previous visit, lying somewhere the player remembered from that encounter, relocated to a spot no combat had occurred near. The homestead's geometry, the barn, the fences, the open ground, rearranged between visits in ways consistent with something having moved through it and adjusted the arrangement of what it found. The snallygaster does not think about the impression this leaves. It moves its kills to the distance that its behavioral code specifies, and the distance it specifies produces, in environments that players return to, the appearance of deliberate rearrangement. Something at Billings keeps changing where things are. The reason is territorial instinct executing a simple rule. The effect is a homestead that never quite looks the same way twice. Deeper in Appalachian territory, below a ridge that gives Wendigo Cave its approach, a 14-page journal was found near the entrance. The author survived an encounter with a Wendigo and wrote about it at a length that suggests the encounter stayed with them in ways that required extended processing to manage. The Wendigo is a cannibalism-induced mutation, a transformation that specific conditions of starvation and choice produce in a human body, extending the limbs, hollowing the features, stripping the original person's form into something much harder to categorize as either human or animal. Most encounters with Wendigos end in attack. The one documented in those 14 pages did not. The final line of the final page reads, "It did not attack me. It looked at me. I think it was trying to remember something." The creature's biology is well enough understood that the physical process creating it can be described in clinical terms. What is not understood, what no clinical description addresses, is what remains inside the transformation. The journal's author, who survived by not being attacked, offered an interpretation that the thing looking at them was attempting to access something the mutation had buried, but not destroyed, something from before the conditions that produced the Wendigo. The mountains of Appalachia keep things alive, in forms that are no longer recognizable as what they started as. Whether those forms retain any awareness of the distance between what they are and what they were, is a question Wendigo Cave has been adjacent to for 2 centuries, without providing a clear answer. Inside Blackwater Mine, well below the surface, cave crickets produce a sound that reaches the nervous system before it reaches conscious awareness. The sound itself is ordinary, insect chirping, the kind of sound associated with summer evenings and open fields, and the ordinary backdrop of a world that has not been irradiated. The Fallout 76 audio team recorded genuine cave cricket samples and used them as the foundation. Layered beneath that foundation, at 18 Hz, is a frequency that sits below the threshold of conscious hearing, but within the range that the body registers as a physical sensation. This frequency, called infrasound, has been associated in research outside the game with feelings of unease, dread, and the sense of an unexplained presence. The crickets in Blackwater Mine chirp with something underneath the chirp that the ears do not process as sound, but the body processes as warning. Players moving through the mine reported anxiety before they made contact with any creature, attributing the feeling to the dark, to the enclosed space, to the general atmosphere of the location. The chirping was already working. The mine's smallest residents, tucked into rock fissures and ceiling gaps, were producing the most effective threat response of anything in the shaft, through sound, at a frequency that bypassed every layer of rational evaluation and reached something that does not wait to be convinced. Above the mine, above the trees, above the ridgeline of the cranberry bog, something crosses the sky that has no equivalent anywhere else in the documented wasteland. The scorch beast is a bat. It is also the mechanism through which the scorched plague spreads. It is also the apex predator of a three-tier hierarchy that includes the scorched and the scorch beasts themselves, a biological command structure that emerged without any human engineering from a region that had no prior precedent for producing it. Fallout 76's design team described the creature in internal documentation as a uniquely Appalachian evolution, something that the specific combination of West Virginia's nuclear contamination and its existing bat population produced, and that could not have come from the conditions present in any other region of the wasteland. No other Fallout game contains a scorch beast. No other region produced the conditions that created one. The Cranberry Bog's air belongs to it in a way that the wasteland's other flying threats, which exist in smaller numbers, without plague-spreading capability, without anything resembling the hierarchical relationship the scorch beast maintains with its infected, do not replicate. Appalachia built something at the top of a food chain that it also built from scratch, without assistance, in the absence of human oversight, over a period of time that no record captures with precision. The mountains made it alone. The sky above the bog is its territory. Everything below the territory is, in some sense, downstream of whatever the scorch beast decides to do next. Appalachia does not explain its creatures. It does not provide documentation or context, or a scientific framework that makes what it produced feel like the result of understandable processes. The mountains kept their own counsel before the war, during the war, and in the centuries that followed. What they generated in that silence is what walked out of the trees and looked at survivors from a distance, and rearranged what it killed, and remembered something it could not name, and chirped in frequencies that reached below thought. The continent falls away to the west. The research crater known as the Big Empty sits in the Nevada desert, and what was built inside it was the opposite of silence. It was the result of scientists who documented everything, who explained their methods in careful language, who knew precisely what they were creating, and created it anyway. The X-13 research facility still has a cafeteria. The tables are set. Not neatly. 2 centuries of settling and dust have shifted things, but the arrangement is recognizable as the arrangement of a space where people once sat and ate and talked about their work. The chairs are pulled out at angles that suggest someone stood up from them in a hurry and never came back to push them in. The serving counter still has trays on it. None of this is what makes X-13 difficult to spend time in. What makes it difficult is that the corridors are still in use, not by anyone who chose to use them, by bodies that were relieved of the relevant decision-making equipment years ago and have been walking the same routes ever since, to the cafeteria, to the testing chambers, to the exit that sealed long before anyone currently moving toward it was in any condition to understand why the door would not open. The Big Empty ran its experiments on everything. Some of the experiments are still running. The cafeteria is still receiving visitors. They do not eat anything when they arrive. Lobotomites move through X-13's corridors in patterns that match the building's original pedestrian logic, not because any behavioral instruction directs them toward the cafeteria, or the testing wing, or the sealed exit, because the building's navigation architecture was designed around how researchers actually moved through the space, and that architecture still underlies everything that moves inside it. The paths the lobotomites take are the paths that were built for the people who used to walk them. The brains that organized those walks were removed during procedures that Big MT considered scientific progress. The feat continued. There is a specific quality to watching something arrive at a door that has not opened in a very long time and stand in front of it. The lobotomite at the sealed exit does not wait with any expectation visible in its posture. It arrives. It stands. After some period, it turns and follows the route back. The routine was never updated to account for the door being sealed. The brain that might have updated it is not present. X-13's researchers are still going to work. The work stopped. The going did not. In the Z14 Pepsin DNA splicing lab, a different kind of experiment is still completing itself on its own schedule. The Robo-Scorpion was built through a fusion process. Mechanical scorpion chassis combined with organic rad scorpion tissue at a ratio that Dr. 8, one of the think tank's surviving scientists, documented as 60% mechanical to 40% organic. The terminal entry where he recorded this ratio includes a line that was not part of any formal research protocol. The organic component is still attempting to grow. I've stopped trying to prevent it. The Robo-Scorpion model in the released game shows organic tissue pressing through gaps in the mechanical frame. This was added by one member of the art team, working independently from whoever wrote Dr. 8's terminal entry. The texture work and the written record were produced separately by different people and arrived at the same conclusion. The biological material inside the chassis had not accepted the boundaries the chassis was meant to impose. A scientist's research note and an artist's texture decision, created without coordination, both described the same ongoing process. The organic component was still growing. The lab's containment had not addressed this. The lab scientist had stopped trying. At the Y-17 medical facility, a night stalker moves through the corridors with an awareness of its surroundings that exceeds what the standard version of the same creature possesses. The aggro range, the distance at which the creature registers a target and begins moving toward it, is larger here than anywhere else a night stalker is found, in the Mojave or in the Big Empty. A behavior flag in the creature's data, labeled tracker.enhanced, produces this expanded range without any in-game explanation for why this specific animal is different from its counterparts. A cut terminal entry from Y-17 provided that explanation before it was removed. An olfactory cortex transplant, added to produce a tracking capability, rated at 12 miles of scent range. The entry was taken out. The flag remained. The creature's senses were built for a distance that the research crater's walls make impossible to use. It can detect things from further away than any other night stalker. It cannot go further than the crater's edge. The range it was given, and the space it inhabits, are incompatible in a way that no one remaining at Big MT has the capacity to address. In the Sync's botanical research chamber, rooted to the floor and unable to reposition, a spore plant has been solving a military targeting problem that human engineers spent considerable effort on before the war. Spore plants fire their projectiles in arcs. The trajectory calculation used by the game's AI for this attack was borrowed from the same system used for grenade-throwing behaviors, a ballistic arc physics model designed for thrown ordnance. The result is that spore plant projectiles travel upward before descending toward a target, clearing cover that a direct fire attack would strike. Players who took positions behind obstacles and expected the standard behavior of a stationary plant, direct fire, blocked by walls, found spores descending from above their cover. The plant cannot move. It is fixed in the chamber floor by its own root structure. Its only offensive capability is the arc its spores travel. That arc, produced by a targeting system borrowed from a different weapon type entirely, does what artillery does. It clears obstacles by going over them rather than through them. Big MT's botanical research produced, without intending to, a stationary weapons platform with indirect fire capability. The chamber's plant solved the problem through borrowed physics. The military engineers who worked on the same problem before the war used considerably more resources and produced less consistent results. In the X8 Research Center's courtyard, the Cazador's origin is recorded in terminals that the Big MT team left with characteristic thoroughness. The giant wasp was engineered here. The documentation is clear on this. Genetic modification targeting venom potency, wing structure, and aggression threshold, aimed at producing a creature capable of neutralizing human targets rapidly through contact. The Cazadors throughout the wider Mojave are descendants of X8 specimens that left the crater through containment failures over the years following the research team's effective disappearance. The engineering produced exactly what the design specified. The creatures that spread across the desert outside the crater are the documented outcome of a documented process. The inconsistency sits in Fallout 2's California, where references to giant wasp creatures appear in records that predate the Big MT program's documented start by decades. Either the timeline recorded in X8's terminals is wrong, or something resembling what Big MT engineered was already developing independently in the western regions before any laboratory accelerated the process. Both possibilities carry the same implication. The Cazador may not be an invention. It may be a discovery that was then improved upon. What the crater perfected might have been arriving on its own regardless. The courtyard's enhanced specimens represent the deliberate version of something the landscape was already producing at its own pace. Near the perimeter of the crater, at an outpost positioned at the edge of the Big Empty's boundary, a terminal entry connects the research facility to a place it was never supposed to be associated with. The entry references personnel sent to something called the Villa Project, workers equipped with suits engineered to filter a chemical compound called the Cloud. The suits were Big MT products. The Villa was the Sierra Madre. The terminal records the deployment in the language of a logistics note. Personnel count, equipment issued, departure date. One line at the end addresses something the engineering team had identified, but apparently not weighted heavily. Suit adhesion was considered a theoretical side effect. It was not considered a problem. The people sent to the Sierra Madre in Big MT suits became the ghost people. The Cloud's chemistry bonded the suit material to the wearers permanently. The theoretical side effect that was not considered a problem became the condition that defined everything about what those people are now. The regeneration, the inability to die by conventional means, the complete absence of anything recognizable from the lives they had before the deployment. Big MT sent workers to the Villa. Big MT did not retrieve them. The outpost terminal is the only record that the connection between the two locations was ever formally noted by anyone in a position to have done something about it. Inside the think tank's central dome, a kennel block that smells of animals that have been gone for a long time holds a container with one item in it. The Canine Enhancement Project, referenced in think tank terminals, was never given a formal name in any surviving record. What it had was an objective: neurological augmentation to increase tactical obedience in domesticated dogs, and an outcome: abandonment, when subjects began directing their augmented aggression toward the handlers rather than away from them. The kennels in the dome still hold the physical infrastructure of the project: built enclosures, feeding mechanisms, the general arrangement of a space that was designed to house animals being studied. The animals are gone. The item in the container is labeled Enhanced Collar Prototype. Its weight is 0. Its listed function is absent. The crafting system has no recipe that uses it. It sits in a kennel that held something that was supposed to learn to follow instruction, in a facility that produced more things that stopped following instruction than things that continued. And it does nothing. Big MT's documentation is extensive. The records cover procedure, outcome, and failure mode with equal thoroughness. What the records do not cover is the gap between what the science intended and what the science produced, because the scientists inside the think tank's containers are still operating inside the logic of what they intended and have not updated their understanding to account for what they actually made. The collar has no function. The kennel is empty. The terminal entries still refer to the project in the present tense. The crater's walls hold everything that Big MT created inside them. The things that escaped, the Cazadors, the ghost people in their sealed suits, carry pieces of the research into places the research was never intended to reach. What was built here, with intention, and recorded with care, produced outcomes that the documentation did not predict, and the scientists did not survive to correct. The road out of the Big Empty leads toward a place where the same is true for entirely different reasons. A casino under a chemical sky, where what was sent there was never brought back, and the things walking the halls have names pressed into material that will not come off. The Sierra Madre Casino opened before the war and never closed. Not in the way that matters. The doors are still sealed. The cloud still fills the streets of the villa outside. The broadcast signal still reaches across the desert and pulls people toward a grand opening that never actually happened. The casino prepared itself for a celebration, and the celebration never came, and in the absence of that event, everything inside the villa simply continued the preparations. The lights stayed on, the automated systems kept running, the things walking the residential district kept walking it. The Sierra Madre did not close. It just changed what it was open for. Nobody who has gone in has left with everything they arrived with. The villa has a policy about that. It is not posted anywhere. It does not need to be. The ghost people in the Sierra Madre's residential district are the only creatures in the Fallout series that require dismemberment to stay dead. Every other creature, in every other game, operates on a single death threshold. Damage reaches a certain point. The creature stops. Ghost people reach that point and get back up. The hazmat suits they wear, sealed permanently to their bodies by the cloud's chemistry, contain life support systems that continue functioning past the level of damage that would end any unprotected body. Killing a ghost person, by conventional means, produces a temporary result. After a short interval, the suit's systems restore enough function for the body to resume movement. The only way to produce a permanent outcome is to remove a limb. Crippling or severing something the suit cannot compensate for disrupts the restoration cycle. This was documented in developer notes as an intentional mechanic reflecting the suit's function. What the notes did not document was the implication that followed from it, that the villa's primary inhabitants cannot be ended by the same means that end everything else in the wasteland. Visitors to the Sierra Madre have to find a different way to stop what is coming at them, and the different way requires taking something. The ghost people, who were themselves taken from their lives by a suit they cannot remove, have passed that condition along to everyone who enters the residential district. Nothing here ends without something being given up. In the casino's service corridors, the maintenance passages behind the public-facing architecture, a trapper variant moves through spaces it has already prepared. The trapper is distinguished by the tools it carries and deploys: bear traps, wire snares, arrangements of catching mechanisms placed in advance of any encounter. The game's AI system had no native behavior for creatures placing traps in real time. Obsidian implemented the trap laying as a scripted pre-encounter state. When the trapper spawns, the traps around it are already positioned. The creature does not place them in response to a target. It exists in spaces that are already arranged for catching something. The effect of this implementation is that the service corridors of the Sierra Madre Casino were set up before any visitor arrived. Whoever enters those passages enters spaces that were prepared for their entry. The trapper did not react to the sound of approaching footsteps and begin positioning its tools. It was already done. The corridors were ready. The traps were in place. The only thing the service passengers were waiting for was someone to walk into arrangements that had been made specifically around the dimensions and movement patterns of a person trying to move through them carefully. At the villa's central fountain plaza, the fastest variant of Ghost Person produces a sound assembled from 3 recordings that should not share a frequency. The hound's vocalization during an attack draws from a slowed dog bark for its lower register, a processed human exhale for its mid-range, and a radio-static frequency for its upper layer. The radio-static is not a generic sound. It is the same frequency used in the Sierra Madre's broadcast signal, the transmission that reaches across the desert and promises safety to anyone within range. People followed that frequency to the villa. The cloud took them, the suits sealed, and now the things moving fastest through the fountain plaza emit, as they close the distance between themselves and whoever is trying to cross the open ground, the same audio frequency that brought their targets here. The call and the creature, hunting through the aftermath of the call, share a voice. The broadcast said, "Come." The hound in the plaza says the same thing, at the same frequency, for entirely different reasons. The villa's signal has been consistent throughout, only the meaning has shifted. Near the base of the broadcasting tower, where the cloud is densest and the signal is strongest, something appears in the fog that has no entry in any creature record. Under specific density conditions, the cloud's particle system generates visual shapes: brief, upright, human proportioned. that form in the thick concentration near the tower base before dissipating. These are rendering artifacts. The particle physics calculating the cloud's movement under sufficient density produces arrangements that the visual processing system interprets as figures. No developer documented this. No scripting produced it. The shapes have no health, no behavioral AI, no loot, no interaction. They appear and they are gone. Players who were near the tower and witnessed the shapes reported seeing people standing in the cloud, standing still, not moving toward anything, not moving away. The tower's cloud is thicker than anywhere else in the villa. The signal originates here, and in the thickest part of what the signal fills, something occasionally takes a human shape for a moment before the density shifts and the shape dissolves. The game has no record of it. The cloud does not require a record. In Dean Domino's private suite, the personal space maintained by the Sierra Madre's pre-war entertainment director, a holographic security emitter runs on a cycle that distinguishes it from every other emitter in the villa. Holographic security constructs throughout the Sierra Madre respawn when a player leaves the area and returns. The emitter in Dean's suite respawns on a 24-hour in-game cycle, regardless of player position. A single-level designer applied a different flag to this placement than to any other emitter in the location. The suite's guardian regenerates on its own schedule, independently of whether anyone is present to require guarding. After Dean is gone, after whatever the player decides about Dean has been decided, the emitter continues its cycle. The construct appears. It runs its security protocol on empty rooms. The suite has been looted. The person it was protecting is not there. The machine producing the Guardian does not have access to this information. It runs the cycle because the cycle is what it was built to run. The most reliable thing in the Sierra Madre is a light construct standing watch over nothing, on a schedule set by someone who is no longer present, in a suite belonging to someone who is no longer there, inside a casino that has been preparing for a party that will not happen for 200 years and counting. The loyalty is genuine. The context for it is entirely gone. In the Salida del Sol district, the outdoor residential section of the villa, where the architecture opens to the sky and the cloud moves through courtyard spaces, a note written before the war records something that the cloud did not cause. The author was a villa resident. The note's date places it before the bombs, before the broadcast signal activated, before the hazmat suits were issued to anyone. The gardeners, the note explains, had reported that the hedges in the south courtyard were moving without wind. The author had submitted a formal complaint to management. The note ends there. No response from management is recorded anywhere in the villa's surviving documents. The cloud arrived later. The suits sealed later. The ghost people became what they are through a process that postdates the note by some margin. But the hedges were moving before any of that. The Salida del Sol district was already doing something before the disaster that supposedly explains everything the Sierra Madre became. What the cloud intensified was present before the cloud. What the suits created was preceded by something that moved without wind in a south courtyard that a resident found unusual enough to complain about formally. The complaint reached management. Management did not reply. Whatever was in the courtyard continued. At the casino's vault level, below the gambling floors, below the service corridors, in the deepest accessible space in the Sierra Madre, the most powerful ghost person in the facility carries something inside its suit that no encounter with it makes visible. On the highest graphics setting, the hazmat material covering the legendary ghost person shows text pressed into the surface from the inside, not printed on, but embossed, as though pushed outward from within the suit. Serial numbers, a big MT facility code, and a partial name. 3 letters legible, E-L-I. The rest is obscured by damage to the suit material. No character in Dead Money is named Eli. No terminal entry, no note, no holotape in the villa references anyone by that name. A texture artist added it, and left no documentation explaining why. The most dangerous thing in the casino has a name. The name is inside the suit, on the interior surface of material that cannot be removed, pressed outward as though whoever is inside wanted it readable from outside. No one in the game reads it. The vault level does not provide enough light or enough time, Someone placed the name there regardless, pressed into a suit on a person who has been in the Sierra Madre long enough that the name is the only remaining evidence that there was ever a specific person inside. The villa kept what it received: the names, the routines, the signals, the shapes in the cloud. What entered the Sierra Madre did not leave. What could not be kept alive was kept moving. The casino prepared for an opening night and received, instead, everything that followed the broadcast, and held on to all of it with the particular loyalty of a place that was built to welcome visitors and never developed a procedure for letting them go. The cloud thins at the edges of the villa's reach. East of the Sierra Madre, the landscape changes from chemical haze to something rawer, a scar in the geography where a place called the Divide was destroyed so completely that the creatures living in it now are not things that survived the destruction. They are things the destruction made. Before the Divide was destroyed, it was a road, a supply route, the kind of infrastructure that a civilization trying to hold territory across a large geography needs, maintained by the people whose movement along it kept it functional. Communities formed near it. Buildings went up. The ordinary accumulation of human settlement around a useful corridor happened the way it always happens, and for a period, the Divide was a place where people lived near the road they depended on. Then the ground split open. The storms began. The structures came down in a sequence that left some of them standing at angles that should not be possible, held in place by debris and pressure and the particular physics of a collapse that was still in progress when it stopped. What was a road became something else, a landscape defined by what happened to it, rather than by what it was built to be. The creatures here did not move in from somewhere else. The Divide did not attract wildlife that adapted to new conditions. It made something. From the absence of what had been there, and from the specific violence of how that absence was created, it made something that had not existed anywhere before. Tunnelers did not exist before the Divide's destruction. This is stated directly by Ulysses, who was present in the region during the period that separates before from after. He watched the destruction occur. He observed the aftermath. What he records is not a population of existing creatures adapting to changed conditions. It is the appearance of something new. Animals that were not present before the ground opened, that showed up in the wreckage as though the wreckage itself had generated them. Every other creature in the Fallout universe traces back to something that existed before the bombs. Radiation altered animals that were already present. FEV transformed humans and other organisms that had their own prior form. The Deathclaw began as a Jackson's chameleon. The Ghoul began as a person. The Cazador began as a wasp. There is always a before. The tunneler has no before that anyone has identified. The collapsed highway overpass near the Divide's entry point holds animals that burrowed their way into existence through a disaster and have been burrowing through the wreckage ever since. The disaster did not transform anything. It created something. The Divide is the only location in the series where this happened, and no source explains how. Along the Courier's Mile, the stretch of road most heavily populated by what the Divide produced from the soldiers who were caught inside it when the storms came, something leaks through in the audio. Marked men are what NCR and Legion soldiers became when the Divide's irradiated wind removed their skin and the subsequent exposure resealed it under conditions that fused the two sides of a conflict into a single category of damaged person. They retained enough biology to remain technically human. They retained enough history to carry audio fragments of who they were, partial radio call signs from NCR communications protocol, phrases from Legion formations, the acoustic debris of two organizations whose members were compressed into the same category of ruined survivor. Along the mile, where these survivors are most concentrated, the fragments play simultaneously. An NCR identifier runs over a Legion phrase. Two recordings from organizations that spent years trying to destroy each other overlap in a single corridor because the people who carried them were compressed into the same material. The Divide fused them physically through exposure. The sound design fused them in the audio layer by placing the fragments in close enough proximity that overlap became inevitable. The corridor on the mile is where neither identity won and both identities persist, in the form of audio that was never meant to share a frequency with what it is currently sharing a frequency with. At the Hopeville missile silo, one of the few enclosed structures in the divide still standing with enough integrity to enter, Deathclaws move through the surrounding terrain and stop at the threshold. They do not follow prey inside. Players who retreated into the silo during an engagement found the Deathclaws waiting at the entrance when they emerged, rather than having followed them through. The developer explanation for this is navigational. The silo's interior geometry was not fully processed for large creature pathfinding, leaving the interior effectively inaccessible to anything above a certain size. The Deathclaw stops at the door because the system that tells it where it can go does not include the space beyond the door. The effect produced by this limitation is a creature that will pursue across open terrain without hesitation and then stop at a threshold that a destroyed building creates. In a landscape where almost everything has been leveled, the remaining walls of a silo are enough to establish a boundary the divide's most aggressive resident will not cross. What reads as restraint, as a decision about doorways and enclosed spaces, is a navigation limit. The destroyed buildings of the divide are still doing something. They are still providing a boundary. The Deathclaws at Hopeville have not entered a structure in 200 years of the silo's existence, and the silo has not given them a reason to try. At the wind farm wreckage, where pre-war turbines were installed to convert the region's constant air movement into power, and now stand at broken angles, many of them spinning still, because the wind has not stopped. The rad scorpions carry something the desert version of the same creature does not show. The chitin is wrong, not in coloration, in surface quality. Where the Mojave rad scorpion's shell is smooth and reflective, the divide variant is matte. The surface shows fine lines running across the plates in directions that follow the geometry of stress failure, the pattern that material makes when force is applied over a long period in changing directions. The art team applied this texture to reflect what the divide's particulate storms do to hard surfaces over time. The same storms that made the terrain lethal for anything without radiation resistance have been doing the same work on the chitin of the creatures that live in the storms. The divide's rad scorpions are being slowly fractured by the conditions that they have also adapted to survive. The environment that made them viable is also, at a pace slower than their adaptation, taking them apart. Along the access road to the Ashton missile silo, the bloatflies carry something in their loot tables that does not belong to them. A sealed container labeled Divide Wind Sample appears in the drop data for the storm variant found in this region. The item was listed as a crafting component for a radiation-based thrown weapon in an earlier build of Lonesome Road. The weapon recipe was cut before release. The loot tag was not updated to reflect this. Players who killed the insects and collected what they dropped received sealed containers of the Divide's toxic atmosphere. Portable, sealed, apparently gathered and held by insects in a way that no biological mechanism accounts for. The crafting use that would have given the collection a purpose was removed. The collection continues regardless. The bloatflies along the Ashton Road still carry the wind in sealed form, still drop it when killed, still imply through their loot table a weapon that no longer exists in any recipe the game contains. The Divide's air can be collected from insects. What to do with it once collected is a question the development team answered and then removed the answer to. In the canyon wreckage area, a stretch of collapsed terrain where the Divide's geography makes landmarks unreliable, and routes that appeared stable have a tendency to shift. A holotape records something that is not a creature, and has no encounter data, and has been absent from the Divide for the entire duration of the game's existence. Ulysses kept a dog in the period before the Divide's destruction. The tape describes the dog entering the wreckage during the chaos of the ground splitting and not returning. He searched. He found tracks. The tracks reached a point where the ground had shifted enough to make the path the tracks came from no longer continuous, and beyond that point there was nothing. No body, no continuation, no resolution. The dog has no model in the game's data. It was not implemented as a discoverable encounter. Data from development builds suggests it was planned as something a player could find. Evidence of the animal, or the animal itself, somewhere in the canyon wreckage, and was cut before release. What remained is a holotape that ends with tracks ending, in a landscape where the ground moves often enough that whatever the tracks led toward may not be accessible from the same direction anymore. The divide took the dog. The divide did not produce a body. The tracks still end at the point where the holotape stopped being able to follow them. In Hopeville's town center, the open area at the heart of what was once a settlement, and is now the divide's architectural archive of interrupted ordinary life, an iBot floats at a damaged altitude, playing recordings it should not have. EDE is a companion from the main game, a small, floating robot that accumulated information during its travels by absorbing data from terminals it passed near. In Lonesome Road, a version of EDE appears in the Divide, damaged and broadcasting. The logs it plays in this location include 3 recordings, not available through any other point in the game. Enclave Communications, referencing a project called Eden Mark I, distinct from President Eden's ZAX unit. The logs were placed in this version of EDCAX by Obsidian's team and were never addressed in any post-release developer commentary. No other game references the project. No terminal in the main game acknowledges it. A robot that absorbed data from terminals encountered during a journey across the wasteland is playing recordings of a program that no surviving record outside those 3 logs confirms existed. Damaged, at reduced altitude, in the most destroyed location in the Mojave, still broadcasting information about something that may not have been intended to be heard. The Divide was not a place that preserved things. It ended things. The road, the communities, the soldiers, the dog, the ground itself. The Divide took the before of all of it and replaced it with an after that looked nothing like what preceded it. What lives in the after was not carried over from the before. It came from the ending itself. It came from the specific violence of a place that went from being a root to being a scar, and from the long stillness of a scar that has never fully closed. North from the Divide, the storms become a memory. The terrain changes to something older and greener. Appalachia's underground has been keeping its own version of the dark for 2 centuries, and what has been living in that dark without any surface observer has had time to become something the surface would not recognize. The lower decks of Rivet City are empty, not abandoned in the way that most places in the Capital Wasteland are abandoned, with evidence of hasty departure, scattered belongings, the general residue of people who left in a hurry and intended to return. The lower decks are empty in a more deliberate way. The rooms are intact, the corridors are navigable. The flooding that reached certain sections did not destroy the architecture. Everything is present, except the thing that was supposed to be in it. Navigation paths run through those flooded corridors that lead to positions where something was meant to stand. Spawn markers sit at coordinates where something was meant to appear. The mesh for the creature exists in the game's files. The creature itself was removed before anyone could encounter it. The rooms were built for something. The something is not there. The rooms have been waiting, in the lower levels of a ship that became a city, for the entire time the game has existed. That is a particular kind of darkness. Not the dark of things that live underground, the dark of a space that was designed for an occupant, and then the occupant was taken out, and the space was left as it was, still shaped for what was supposed to fill it. In Vault 92's flooded lower level, a Mirror-Lurk queen does not move. The chamber she occupies was finalized after she was placed inside it, and the dimensions that were settled on left her model with insufficient room to navigate. She stands in the center of the water and attacks anything that enters the chamber's range, but she does not advance. She does not pursue. Post-release commentary from Bethesda's team acknowledged the placement as an error. The queen arrived before the room around her was complete, and by the time the discrepancy was identified, players had already formed a different understanding of what her stillness meant. What players understood was territory, a queen who had chosen this specific flooded space and seen no reason to leave it. A creature so settled in its claim that approach, rather than proximity, was what triggered a response. The error produced a behavioral reading that no intentional design had created, a boss creature that did not move because it had already arrived exactly where it intended to be. The vault's lower level belonged to her, in a way that the placement mistake made more convincing than a scripted territorial behavior might have. She was there. She stayed. The water held her position, and the chamber held her claim, and the mistake held both of those things in place for the duration of the game. Below street level in the District of Columbia, beneath a building called the Dunwich Building, whose upper floors already contain more hostility than most locations in the eastern ruins, the sub-basement holds something the terminal entries tried to explain before most players thought to read them. The feral ghoul reaver, the most powerful variant, appears in the sub-basement in concentrations that stand out against the building's upper floors. A terminal entry references a pre-war cult that used the basement for rituals involving an entity called Ugg-Qualtoth. The Reavers were placed by Bethesda's team to reinforce this narrative. Creatures in a space with established occult history, providing the ambient threat. But one terminal line, easy to miss in the volume of text the building contains, reads, "They are not angry, they are waiting." The Reavers in the sub-basement do not engage until the player reaches the final chamber. Every other Reaver in the building aggroes on sight. The ones below do not move until something arrives at the specific location the cult used. The terminal said they were waiting. The behavior confirmed it. Whether the design team built the passive behavior to match the terminal entry, or whether the terminal entry was written to explain a behavior flag someone else set, is not documented. Both pieces arrived at the same conclusion through whatever process produced them. The sub-basement's Reavers are not guarding. They are expecting something. Whatever they are expecting, the final chamber is where they determined it would appear. In the unfinished sections of Vault 88, the incomplete facility, accessible through a workshop expansion, fungal growth covers the walls in a faint bioluminescent pattern that glows in the absence of other light sources. The glow has a source in the game's data that is no longer present in the game itself. A creature entry labeled Vault 88 Spore. Creature was removed from the encounter data before the vault was released. Its spawn markers remain at positions throughout the unfinished sections, the fungal textures that were designed to accompany it, to create the environmental context for a bioluminescent organism, were partially incorporated into the vault's surfaces before the removal, and were not pulled back out when the creature was cut. The result is a vault whose walls glow with the textures of something that was supposed to live there, at positions where something was supposed to stand, in rooms that were finished around a creature that is no longer in them. The unfinished sections of Vault 88 are lit by the absence of what was planned for them. The glow comes from something that was removed. The architecture still shows the shape of what it was designed to hold. Below the surface colony at Quarry Junction, in the tunnel network that runs under the main quarry floor, a single Deathclaw lives in a way that distinguishes it from every other member of its species in the region. Standard Deathclaw encounters propagate. When one engages, others in the surrounding area receive an alert and respond. The quarry's surface colony operates this way. Engaging one pulls others into the combat. The tunnel variant does not send the alert. When it is found and engaged, it fights without the signal reaching the colony above. No pack response, no reinforcement. The behavioral flag responsible for alert propagation is absent from this specific creature in a way that was not intentional. The flag was simply never assigned, likely because the tunnel creature was added to the encounter data at a stage when the standard pack behavior was not yet being applied universally. What the missing flag produced is a Deathclaw that has been living below the surface colony without being included in whatever communication system ties them together. Players who encountered it described the experience in terms that did not focus on the creature's power or speed. They focused on the isolation, something that belongs to a species defined by group behavior, living in the tunnels beneath its own colony, disconnected from the alerts and responses that make the surface colony what it is. It had been down there long enough that the surface had stopped accounting for it. The tunnels held it in a way the colony above had ceased to acknowledge. At the abandoned waste dump in Appalachia's more remote territory, under specific server event conditions, something emerges that the Wasteland's documentation does not account for. The Wendigo Colossus is a multi-limbed, enormous variant of the standard Wendigo, substantially larger, with additional arms and a physical scale that places it well outside what the normal mutation process that produces Wendigos has been documented as capable of generating. It was not in any pre-launch material. Players found it after release. No terminal entry in Fallout 76 addresses it. No note, no holotape, no researcher's record acknowledges that something of this scale emerged from the same cannibalism-induced mutation that produces the smaller variant found in Wendigo Cave. The standard Wendigo has accumulated lore context, the folklore basis, the biological mechanism, the human origins of the transformation. The Colossus arrived in the game's encounter system without any of this. Something enormous appeared at the waste dump without explanation, and the 2 centuries of wasteland history that are extensively documented for almost everything else the region produced have nothing to say about how. In Rivet City's lower decks, the navmesh paths and spawn coordinates for the cut antlion creature trace routes through flooded corridors that lead to positions at which nothing now stands. The antlion's mesh is complete in the game's files. A large subterranean insect, modeled and rigged, exists in the data in a state that suggests it was close to deployment before the decision to cut it was made. The lower decks, where it was intended to appear, are accessible to players and contain nothing hostile. This is unusual. Almost every other enclosed hostile environment in the Capital Wasteland contains some threat, even at lower intensity. The flooded lower sections of Rivet City, a location that functions as a major hub, that contains merchants and residents and significant narrative content, have empty corridors below the inhabited levels, where the navmesh still holds paths for something to walk, and the spawn markers still hold positions for something to occupy. The aircraft carrier city has been floating above those empty rooms for the game's entire lifespan. The rooms have been ready. Nothing has arrived to fill them. In the necropolis, underground in the structure that houses the settlement's water infrastructure, the first significant enemy encounter in Fallout series history stands in a chamber that contains the most important object in the first game. The Rad Scorpion Queen at the water pump in Fallout 1's necropolis guards the pump that the Vault Dweller must reach to progress the central quest. A designer note recovered from Black Isle's development records documents the placement decision in its entirety. Put the big one by the water. Make them earn it. 9 words. No elaboration. No discussion of behavioral mechanics or encounter design philosophy. A note that communicated the essential logic of the placement. The most important thing in the dungeon should be the hardest to reach, and left everything else to execution. The Queen does not move. She holds the pump chamber the way the Vault 92 Queen holds her flooded room, positioned at the center of the space, defending it by occupying it. The pump provides water to everything above ground in the necropolis. The Queen is underground, in the dark, alone with the mechanism that the surface cannot survive without. The designer wrote the note. Someone executed the placement. The Queen has been there since 1997, holding the thing that the first Wasteland needed most. In the first underground space the series ever asked players to descend into. The dark is not the worst thing underground. It is the most organized thing. Everything in the surface world that requires light and movement, and the constant management of exposure to an irradiated sky. All of that uncertainty resolves, underground, into a simpler arrangement. The thing is here. It guards what it guards. The water is on the other side. Make them earn it. The journey rises now toward California. Not the California of the present, but the California of the beginning, where the first Wastelanders encountered what the bombs had produced and named it, and where what was named there became the foundation for everything that followed, east and north, and into every region this journey has covered. In 1997, a creature stood in a corridor in the boneyard, and nothing that approached it survived the approach. It was not named yet. It was not a species yet. It was one creature in one corridor, placed there by a design team that needed a specific kind of problem, something that communicated, without a tutorial or a difficulty indicator, that this particular path was not yet the player's path. The creature achieved this so completely that the corridor became famous before the creature had a proper name. Players talked about it. They described the approach, the speed of what came at them, the completeness of the outcome. The design team read what players were saying and understood that they had made something that would need to be explained. The explanation took decades. What began as a placement became a biology, then a history, then a species documented across 6 games and a television series. None of that existed in 1997. In 1997, there was a corridor and something in it that the Boneyard was not yet ready for the player to pass. Everything that came after began as a design problem with a 4-word solution that worked completely. Before the Boneyard, before the Deathclaw had a species, there was Mariposa. The FEV vats at Mariposa Military Base are where the first generation of supermutants entered the world as supermutants, humans submerged in the forced evolutionary virus and transformed into something the Master called an improvement. The guards stationed at the vats were themselves products of the process they were protecting. They had been through the vats. They emerged as the thing the vats made. Then they were assigned to guard the vats that made them. The Master placed the transform to protect the transformation. One of these guards, documented in player reports from 1997, walked a patrol route that passed directly in front of a workplace safety poster, still mounted on the facility wall. The poster showed a human figure, the kind of generic, pre-war illustrated worker that appeared on safety materials throughout the old world's industrial infrastructure. The Super Mutants patrol loop was a pathfinding artifact. The poster was pre-placed environmental decoration. No designer connected the two. The Super Mutant passed the image of what it used to be on every loop of a route that nobody intended to mean anything. The developers confirmed the accident when asked. The image of a human on a wall, passed repeatedly by something that had recently been human and would not be again, was not a narrative decision. It happened because of how the navmesh ran and where someone had put a poster. Below Los Angeles, in the catacombs beneath the cathedral that served as the Master's operational center, centaurs moved through corridors that the Master had built for them. These original centaurs were not accidents. Terminal entries in Fallout 1 described them as composite biological constructs, assembled deliberately through FEV exposure, applied to multiple bodies simultaneously, producing fused combinations that the Master catalogued as intentional designs. They were weapons. The fusion was the goal. Producing a mobile combat organism from multiple sources was the specific engineering objective, not a side effect of careless handling. By the time the series reached Fallout 3 and the Eastern Ruins, the same creature existed in a fundamentally altered context. East Coast centaurs were not assembled with intention. They were the result of super mutants disposing of FEV-contaminated material in ways that produced unintended fusions. The design documents and terminal entries that explained the cathedral's centaurs as constructed weapons had no equivalent in the Capital Wasteland. The Eastern version of the creature was what carelessness produced when the structured approach of the cathedral was replaced by decades of informal FEV mishandling. The same biological outcome, fused bodies, mobile, hostile, came from entirely opposite organizational contexts. The Master built them. The East Coast made them by accident. Neither version ever knew the difference. In the Boneyard's outskirts, in the corridor that defined what the series would ask of players for the next 25 years, a single creature waited. The Deathclaw in Fallout 1 was calibrated for one purpose: to be an impassable obstacle until the player had developed enough capability to pass it. Designer notes from Black Isle called it the Wall, a colloquial name for a creature used as a gatekeeping mechanism rather than a standard encounter. Its speed, its damage, and its placement in a specific corridor were all set to a single specification. Do not let unprepared players through. The notes used the word wall. They did not use the word creature. The biology came later. Fallout 2 built the species around the wall. It gave the wall a name, a genetic origin. Jackson's chameleon, modified through pre-war military engineering. A pack structure, multiple variants, behavioral documentation. By Fallout 3, the Deathclaw had regional subspecies. By New Vegas, it had territorial behavior. By Fallout 4, it had mothers and nests. The entire documented biology of the Fallout series' most recognized creature was constructed around a placement decision that used the word wall and needed 4 syllables to say what it meant. The wall became the species. The corridor became the origin point of something that spread across every region the series has ever visited. In the mine shafts below Redding, California, a creature that was fully present in 1998 is now entirely absent from every subsequent record. The Wanamingo had a colony in Redding's mines during the events of Fallout 2. It was encountered by the Chosen One. It had established population density, reproductive capability, and territorial behavior consistent with a species that had been in those shafts long enough to establish itself. It was large, tentacled, and sufficiently unlike anything else in the Western Wasteland's ecology to register as genuinely unusual, even in a landscape full of unusual things. Players who cleared the mines documented it. The game documented it. Then Fallout 2 ended, and the Wanamingo ended with it. No subsequent game acknowledges the species. No lore entry explains what happened to the Redding colony after the events of the second game. No researcher in any later game mentions having encountered or studied them. In the Old World Blues DLC for New Vegas, a storage container in the Big Empty is labeled specimen.wo with no further description, whether the W refers to the Wanamingo, and whether whoever labeled the container knew something about the species that no publicly available source records, was never addressed. A creature with a colony and a documented encounter history simply stopped being part of the universe after 1998 and left a single, ambiguous initial in a storage label as the only possible trace. In New Reno, in the basement beneath an arms dealer operating in a city defined by its commerce in weapons and chemical dependency, a floater occupies space it has no documented reason to occupy. New Reno is urban. The floater is a creature from military installations and open terrain. The combination is not explained in any developer record. The floater in the basement was not hostile on initial contact. It required the player to approach before registering aggression. It was simply present. In a basement, under a gun shop, in a city, not attacking unless approached. The placement has been noted by players and researchers of the series for over 2 decades, without producing an explanation that any source confirms as accurate. The Fallout 2 team left no note. The creature was placed, and the note was not written, or was written and did not survive, or was never written, because whoever placed it considered the placement self-explanatory in ways that have not become apparent in the intervening years. The floater in the New Reno basement is the most inexplicably positioned creature in a series that spans 6 games and 2 television seasons. It remains in the basement. It remains unexplained. On the Enclave's oil rig in the Pacific, among the enhanced deathclaws bred and modified through FEV research for deployment as combat animals, one is different from the rest in a way that no physical examination could identify. A terminal entry on the platform documents it. Subject 13 had begun displaying problem-solving behavior during containment tests. A recommendation for termination was submitted. The recommendation was denied by a colonel whose name is not recorded in the surviving entry. Subject 13's subsequent history is not recorded either. The enhanced death claws on the platform are more powerful than specimens from mainland populations. The FEV work produced measurable improvements in the attributes the Enclave was trying to improve. Whether the improvements also preserved Subject 13, or whether the colonel's denial was eventually overridden, or whether Subject 13 solved problems that included whatever was being done to contain it, the terminal does not say. A deathclaw that solved problems, whose termination was refused, is on that platform somewhere among the other enhanced animals. The terminal identified it as different. The game does not provide a way to identify which one it is. They are all there. Subject 13 is one of them. The platform holds both the knowledge that one of its deathclaws is categorically different from the others, and the complete absence of any mechanism for determining which category any specific individual belongs to. In a grove north of the Capital Wasteland's central ruins, in a place the local population calls Oasis, a tree speaks. Harold has been transforming since before the eastern settlements were established. since before the Capital Wasteland had the name it now holds. His encounter with FEV near Mariposa in California, documented in Fallout 1 as a peripheral event in the Vault Dweller's journey, began a process that 2 centuries had not finished by the time Fallout 3 placed him at Oasis. A sapling, called Bob, grew from his head. Bob became a grove. The grove became an object of reverence for the community that formed around it. Harold became rooted in the earth and immobile and still, by every account, himself. The only being in the Fallout series whose FEV transformation preserved full cognition and personality across 200 years of continuous biological change. He can be ended in Fallout 3 by player choice. He can be allowed to continue spreading. The game frames both options without editorializing. It presents the decision and gives Harold's own perspective on it, and allows the player to decide what mercy means in the specific case of something that started as a person in California and arrived, through no plan of its own, at being a forest in Maryland. He began in the West, where the FEV vats ran and the Master's vision operated, and the first generation of transformed things walked out into a landscape, learning what it was. He ended in the East, rooted, having spent the distance between those 2 points, becoming something that the series has never produced a second example of. The FEV remade almost everything it touched into something that forgot what it was. Harold remembered. He spent 200 years deciding what to do with that. Old California produced the first versions of what the wasteland became. The Mariposa vats sent the first transformed things into the western ruins. The Boneyard Corridor held the wall that became a species. The Redding Mines held something that vanished. The New Reno basement held something that was never explained. The oil rig held something that solved problems and was not terminated. And from California, a man named Harold walked east with a sapling growing from his head and kept walking, internally and biologically, until he arrived at something the language of the wasteland had not developed a category for yet. What California began has been continuing east and north for 2 centuries. The journey now reaches a place where beginning and continuation were finally visible simultaneously, where the wasteland was shown on screen, in live action, and what the camera found in the ruins of Los Angeles was not always what the games had prepared anyone to see. The first time a Deathclaw appeared on a television screen in live action, something happened that 25 years of rendered versions had not quite managed. It was not that the creature was more terrifying as a physical effect than it had been as a game model. The rendered versions across 6 games had developed the Deathclaw's visual language with enough consistency that the live-action version was recognizable within the first frame. What was different was the mouth. When the jaw opened, something inside glowed, not brightly, not dramatically, a faint orange quality, visible in the gap between the teeth, suggesting that whatever metabolic process ran inside a Deathclaw operated at a temperature that left evidence. The games had never shown this. The games had, across 2 decades, left that particular question unanswered. Not because the answer did not exist, but because no one had asked it in a way that required a visual response. The show answered it without announcing that it was answering anything. The jaw opened. The light was there. The biology of the Fallout universe gained a fact it had not previously possessed, delivered through a production decision made by a visual effects team working on a streaming series. What the Wasteland's creatures were made of, internally, became slightly more specific on a highway outside Vault 33. At Philly, the settlement in the Los Angeles wasteland that functions as a trading point and population center in Season 1. The drainage channels that run along the outskirts carry water from wherever the post-war landscape collects and moves water. Something came out of one of those channels in a way that the game version of the same creature does not move. The TV series Gulper emerged low to the ground. The movement was fluid, in the way that an animal built for water moves when it transitions to land, not smooth, but continuous, each limb finding purchase as the body advances, rather than the upright, aggressive posture the Fallout 4 Gulper uses in its animations. The production team consulted Salamander Locomotion for the live-action version, The game team, working on Fallout 4's Far Harbor content, built the Gulpers movement around something more vertical and confrontational. Both are mutated salamanders. Both emerged from the same original biology. The Far Harbor version developed in the Atlantic fog of coastal Maine over 2 centuries. The Los Angeles version developed in whatever the drainage channels of a collapsed city provided over the same period. The silhouettes that resulted from those 2 separate developmental pressures are different enough that a person who knew only one version would not immediately recognize the other as the same creature. 2 paths from the same ancestor, shaped by 2 different environments, across the same stretch of time. The Philly drainage channel showed one of them. The Far Harbor coastline produced the other. On the highway outside Vault 33, when the Deathclaw opened its jaw and the orange glow was visible, 2 things happened simultaneously in the Fallout universe. The first was that a visual effects decision became biological canon. No game had shown internal heat in a Deathclaw. No terminal entry, no research note, no in-universe scientific document had addressed the creature's metabolic temperature. The show added this without framing it as an addition. It appeared in the creature's open mouth as though it had always been there, as though every game that had depicted a Deathclaw had simply not captured this particular angle at this particular moment. The retroactive quality of the detail, its ability to feel like something that was always true rather than something newly invented, is what makes it significant beyond its visual interest. The second thing that happened was that a space in the Fallout universe closed. The games had, collectively, left room for the question of what a Deathclaw's internal biology produced, in terms of heat, or chemistry, or metabolic evidence. That room is now occupied. The jaw opens. The glow is there. The Wasteland's most extensively documented creature gained a fact through a production choice, and the fact fit into the existing record without requiring any existing record to change. CX-404 travels the Wasteland at the side of a man who has not aged in 200 years, and the show does not explain either of them. The dog's survival is not addressed in dialogue. No character comments on her condition. No visual element suggests she has been modified or protected or treated in any way that would account for her longevity in an environment defined by what radiation does to living things. She is present. She moves. She responds to the man beside her, and the show places her in a wasteland that has transformed every other animal it contains and offers no mechanism for why she has been exempted from that transformation. This is the most quietly unsettling detail the show introduced in its first season, not through horror or confrontation, but through omission. The ghouls survived through a process that the show gradually explains. Pre-war exposure, physical transformation, the specific chemistry of ghoulification applied before the bombs fell. CX-404 has no equivalent explanation. She is simply intact. The camera does not linger on this. The characters do not discuss it. The show placed a pre-war dog and a pre-war man together in the post-war wasteland, and let the implication of their shared condition sit in every scene they shared, unaddressed, for an entire season. In Season 2, on the outskirts of New Vegas, the Mojave's rad scorpions demonstrated something the game set in the same region had not shown. New Vegas, the game positioned rad scorpions as a moderate threat, dangerous to unprepared characters, manageable to those with appropriate equipment and levels. Season 2's depiction required multiple armed, experienced characters to engage a single specimen with coordinated effort and full attention. The visual scale was consistent with what the games established. Mojave rad scorpions are smaller than their eastern counterparts, with greater venom potency compensating for the reduced mass. But the threat level the show applied to that scale was substantially higher than the game's encounter design had implied. The timeline of the TV series runs after the events of the game. The Mojave's rad scorpion population, in the years between the game's conclusion and the show's setting, continued to develop in the direction it had been developing. The venom potency that already distinguished the Mojave variant intensified. The speed advantage that made smaller specimens more agile than larger ones became more pronounced. The show documented a Mojave rad scorpion population at a later stage of the same evolutionary trajectory the game had captured at an earlier point. What New Vegas showed was an intermediate state. What Season 2 showed was where that intermediate state was heading. In Freeside, the district outside the New Vegas Strip that serves as the city's rougher outer layer, a pack of animals moved through the ruins in Season 2 that Cooper Howard observed from a position above the street level. The production materials for the show labeled them mutant hounds, larger than the wild dogs that appear throughout the game franchise. With visible mutation in the jaw structure and the density of the body, they moved through Freeside's ruins in a coordinated group that suggested the kind of pack organization documented in other large wasteland predators. Cooper Howard watched them cross the street below and said, in one line of dialogue that received no further attention from the scene around it, "They didn't look like that before." The line is the only moment in the Fallout universe where a character with direct memory of the pre-war world observes a creature's post-war form and documents, from personal recollection, that the form has changed. Cooper Howard was in Las Vegas before the bombs. He knew what the dogs near that city looked like in the world before the war. What he saw crossing the ruins of Freeside in Season 2 was recognizable enough as a dog to produce the comparison, and different enough from what he remembered to produce the reaction. 2 centuries collapsed into one line of dialogue. The dogs had changed. Someone who had seen both versions was present to note the distance between them. The show placed a witness with the right memory in the right location at the right time, and then moved the scene forward without elaborating on what he'd said. In the ruins of Shady Sands, the settlement that was once the foundation of the new California Republic and had been reduced to rubble by events that Season 1 documented in pieces before revealing directly, super mutants moved through background shots in a way that 2 decades of game design had not quite achieved. The variability between individuals was the difference. Game super mutants within a regional group, particularly the West Coast strain, tend toward visual consistency. The same basic proportions, the same general skin tone range, the same approximate body structure, repeated across the population with minor differences. The Shady Sands background shots showed something different. Individuals with substantially different skin tones, different apparent ages of mutation, different body proportions that suggested the FEV process had encountered different starting materials and produced accordingly different results. The show's creature design team stated this was intentional, a reflection that the Los Angeles region's super mutant population drew from a wider range of source individuals than a single FEV facility would produce. The games had implied this logically. FEV transforms what it encounters, and what it encounters varies. But the visual homogeneity of the game models had not reflected it. The show made visible what the law had always technically permitted. FEV does not produce a type. It produces a transformation, and the transformation's result depends on who is being transformed. Every super mutant in those background shots was a specific person. The variability made that harder to abstract away. The screen holds the wasteland differently than a rendered image does. It captures the creatures in a register that the games had been approaching across 25 years of increasing technical capability. And what it found when it reached that register was that the creatures were more individual, more internally complex, and more biologically specific than the distance of a screen had made them appear. The show did not make them scarier, it made them more precise. That precision, in almost every case, was the thing that made them harder to dismiss. The screen dims now, and the journey moves away from what can be seen into what is felt, into the category of creature defined not by where it lives or what made it, but by what it leaves behind in the people who encounter it. The particular kind of damage that specific Fallout creatures produce, the things that cannot be fully reversed.